Coastal Resources Management Council. Today's date is June 2nd, 2021. The time is 5:09 p.m. For council members here tonight, we have myself, Jennifer Cervenka, the chair, Ray Koya, our vice chair,
Ray Koya is present.
Don Gomez,
Gomez present.
Jerry Sahajian,
Present.
Patricia Reynolds,
Reynolds present.
Ron Gagnon,
Ron Gagnon present.
and Lindsay McGovern.
Lindsay McGovern present.
Okay. And for staff, we have Jeff Willis, our executive director,
Present.
James Boyd, our deputy director,
Present, Madam Chair.
Tony DeSisto, our chief legal counsel,
Present, Madam Chair.
Lisa Turner, our recording secretary,
Present, Madam Chair.
Ryan Moore, our moderator,
Present, Madam Chair.
and Cindy Tagney, our court reporter.
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Moore, I know that you reviewed the rules of the Zoom format last time, but in case there are new attendees here, I'd like you to review that for the whole group again tonight, if you would.
Absolutely. This is the Coastal Resources Management Council virtual semi-monthly meeting, 6/2/2021, conducted in accordance with Executive Order 21-40, 143rd Supplemental Emergency Declaration, Extension of Executive Orders. If you're having problems with the computer audio, please use the call-in number for this meeting. The meeting ID, password, and the phone numbers for this meeting will be put in the chat box after this presentation. A note to meeting participants and attendees, please be advised, this is an online meeting, including all audio, video, and names and comments visible in the chat box are being recorded. All members of the public who wish to comment during these proceedings must correctly identify themselves by first and last name before proceeding. Council members, applicants, and CRMC staff, please keep your video on. Do not use phone and computer audio at the same time. Raise your hand or use the raise hand button to be recognized by the chair. Identify yourself by first and last name. Members of the public, please keep your video off, mute your microphone when not speaking. Use the raise hand function to be recognized by the chair. Wait to be recognized by the chair and unmuted by the moderator to speak. Identify yourself by first and last name. For those on the phone, please press *9 to use the raise hand function. When recognized, identify yourself by first and last name. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Moore. First on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of May 25, 2021. Those were circulated earlier by Ms. Turner. Mr.
I have a
Gagnon.
correction.
Yeah.
For the vote that was taken at the end of the meeting on the motion for the parties to have a meeting, I did vote aye on that, not no.
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you, Ron.
Okay, any other revisions, changes? With that correction, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
Madam Chair, Ray Koya moves approval with that correction.
Thank you, Mr. Koya. Is there a second?
Second, Jerry Sahajian.
Thank you, Mr. Sahajian. I'll do a roll call vote to approve the minutes as revised. Ray Koya,
Ray Koya votes aye.
Don Gomez,
Gomez, aye.
Jerry Sahajian,
Sahajian, aye.
Patricia Reynolds,
Reynolds, aye.
Ron Gagnon,
Gagnon, aye.
Lindsay McGovern,
Lindsay McGovern, aye.
and myself, Jennifer Cervenka, aye. The minutes of May 25, 2021 are approved. There are, I don't believe there's any subcommittee reports or staff reports that you'd like to present, Jeff and Jim. Okay, thank you. So we will move on to our main purpose of today's meeting. This is a continued meeting on the discussion and action on federal consistency for South Fork Wind for an offshore wind energy facility in federal waters. We ended our last meeting with the presentation from the FAB. We had a presentation from the developer, South Fork Wind, our staff report, but we did not get to public comment and certainly to our deliberations. So we continued it for those two purposes, for public comment and then our vote. Since the last meeting, May 25, there's been some further clarification of the position of the parties. There was a meeting, and as a result of that, an addendum to the staff report was issued today. And I'd like to start with Mr. Boyd explaining what happened from last meeting to tonight with respect to the parties and maybe some clarification. And then his staff's new or revised recommendation. Mr. Willis, am I saying this wrong?
No, you're saying it fine,
Okay.
Madam Chair. I just would like to have a brief introduction, then we can pass it off to Jim.
Okay, yeah, and then, so we'll have a brief introduction, Jeff, from you, and then, Jeff from you, and then Jim, you'll present the addendum.
Yes. that's
And
correct.
then following that, I'd like to do a brief response, as in 10 to 15 minutes from South Fork Wind, and then one from the FAB. I'd like there just to be one person that gives a concise response that's limited to the new elements that's presented in the addendum. Following that, we'll have public comment. And at our last meeting, we had identified 13 people who wanted to speak, who had raised their virtual hands. Those 13 people are on a list. We understand that there may be some additional people that want to speak tonight. And if that's the case, while we're going through the addendum and some additional presentation, I'd like, anyone and everyone who wants to speak to raise their virtual hand so that our moderator, Mr. Moore, can take down your names. And then we can determine, based on the number, how many minutes each person is going to be limited to. We do want to move through the public comments efficiently. If you can, if it's applicable, I'd like you to speak to your personal knowledge and experience. So for example, if you're a fisherman and you fish in the proposed lease area, I'd like you to speak to that. If you have comments of a more general nature, that's okay too. I would just like those to be short and to the point and not repetitive of others. If you want to say the same thing that's already been said, then just say, I support, X, Y, or Z's comments that have already been made. Because I do expect we'll have a number of people who want to speak, and we will have to have some efficiency and limitations on the time.
Madam Chair, I have a question, excuse me.
Yes, Mr. Sahajian.
Will there be a cutoff time to sign up to speak? Because this could go on perpetually.
Yeah, I want to assess first the number with Mr. Moore. So perhaps after we get through these supplemental presentation and responses, we can take a 5-minute break organizationally to see how many we have, figure out the number of minutes, and then we can have a time cutoff whereby we can then start our deliberations.
Don't you think we should just have a cutoff now? Like if you don't register in the next 30 minutes or something like that? I mean, this could go on forever.
I don't feel comfortable until I know the exact scope of how many people want to speak. That's why I think we should, once we figure that out, we should take a break and then come back in an organized way and then present what the order is going to be and the time limit at that time. Okay, so Mr. Moore, you're going to be taking down the list, correct?
That is correct. I'm doing it as we speak.
Okay, good. So everyone, within the next 30 minutes or so, if you want to speak, please get your hands up, because after that, we won't have you on a list and you won't be called upon to speak. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Willis, for your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had mentioned at the last meeting that we met that staff had met with the developer and the fab over 30 times, mostly these past several months where we've met. And I just wanted to reiterate, those meetings were either attended by all three parties, meaning the staff, the fab, the developer, or as legal counsel explained it at the last meeting, what we refer to as one-on-one meetings where the staff would meet with one party or just the other. And the purpose of those meetings, there were focused attempts to try to find solutions on the mitigation efforts, most notably that compensation element of the mitigation plan. So we held another such meeting yesterday on how those funds within the compensation element of the mitigation plan could be dispersed, because we felt that that aspect was not adequately explained at the last meeting. So at that meeting and follow-ups to that meeting, the developer and representatives for the fab did agree on some concessions, but in the end, we were unable, unfortunately, to find a solution to an actual compensatory disbursement. So therefore, and this is why I wanted to have this introduction, staff felt that we needed to present to you, the council, a further recommendation on what that disbursement could be. And that's what Jim can provide to you now.
Thank you.
Mr. Willis. Mr. Boyd.
Thank you, Madam Chair, council members.
Madam Chair, Ray Coy to be recognized before Jim speaks, please.
Yes, Mr. Koya.
I just need some clarification on the purview or the jurisdiction of our council in the compensatory mitigation process. I mean, my understanding is that staff went to the table with Orsted and Fab and our council many times in an effort to effectuate a dollar amount. And it seems that that may have happened. But at this point, I don't think that we are allowed to mandate mitigation for concurrence as to how it's done, what fund it goes in, or the like. Because, I mean, there's a lot of other protections that have to be put in place for the claims process that may occur. So I just want that on the record that I think we're allowed to assist in a dollar amount, but I think it ends there. And if Tony can just comment on my concern, I'd appreciate it.
Well, in an objection, we've been advised by our partners at NOAA that an objection can't be based on a dollar amount for the mitigation. Rather, the mitigation, the question is whether or not it's sufficient or not. What staff is recommending with the conditional concurrence, and it's based on a variety of things, which Jim is going to address much better than I will be able to. But part of the conditional concurrence recommendation is that this matter be handled similar to how Vineyard Wind was handled for side agreements that would be standalone and enforceable in that manner, rather than having that as part of the concurrence itself. So the proposal from staff will be that if the recommendation is accepted, that there will be time for legal counsel and staff to fashion these side agreements with the developer to address the issues that you've raised in your comments. And that would be a separate agreement aside from the council action. I hope I answered your question.
It's good for now. Thank you.
Madam Chair, council members, if I might just add to what legal counsel just responded to Vice Chair Coya. Keep in mind that under the ocean SAMP enforceable policies, mitigation shall be negotiated between the council staff, the FAB, the project developer, and approved by the council. Keep in mind that under this same enforceable policy, which is section 11.10.1H in the ocean SAMP, also specifies that mitigation measures may include, but are not limited to, compensation, effort reduction, habitat preservation, restoration and construction, marketing, and infrastructure improvements. So as legal counsel DeSisto just mentioned, in the Vineyard Wind matter, the developer, the FAB, CRMC staff negotiated a mitigation package which included compensatory mitigation. And the implementation of that compensatory mitigation will happen through the side agreement that was signed by Vineyard Wind and CRMC. And as a matter of fact, we fully expect the implementation of that agreement to occur later this summer. Vineyard Wind has presently received a record of decision as of May 10th of this year. And all federal permits will be in place in the coming weeks, and Vineyard Wind will reach financial close later this summer. And as required under that mitigation agreement signed and executed between Vineyard Wind and CRMC, Vineyard Wind must begin implementation of that agreement within 60 days of financial close. So that is the mechanism by which CRMC is implementing mitigation measures for the Vineyard Wind, and we are proposing a similar measure here for the South Fork project. So with that, Madam Chair, council members, our staff addendum dated today is very brief. I'm just going to read it into the record for the benefit of attendees here today who may not have yet seen this recommendation, which has been posted up on the council's website. This is the addendum dated today, June 2nd, for the South Fork Wind matter. This is a federal consistency decision. And this again is file 2018-10-082. As the executive director just mentioned a few moments ago, CRMC staff met with representatives of South Fork Wind project developer, which is Ørsted and Eversource as the joint venture here, and representatives for the CRMC Fisherman's Advisory Board, also known as the FAB, yesterday on June the 1st to discuss and negotiate terms of a mitigation agreement. As part of the CRMC mitigation process pursuant to Ocean SAMP Enforceable Policy 11.10.1H, the developer offered compensatory mitigation as part of an overall mitigation proposal, which increased from $8.5 million to $12 million over 30 years as of May 13th. There is continuing disagreement between the parties on a payout over time, that is, over 30 years, 5 years, or one-time lump sum, etc. A direct claims process and the proposed clawback elements of the developer's mitigation proposal. The developer used a discount rate that showed the present value of $12 million over 30 years is $5.2 million when paid in a one-time lump sum. The developer also agreed that the compensatory mitigation could be paid in any manner, so long as it was equal to the equivalent of $12 million paid over 30 years. The end result from the June 1st meeting was that an agreement was only made on the discount rate. While the FAB now accepts the present value discount rate, it still questions the payout schedule and continues to recommend that the council object to the South Fork Wind consistency certification. The FAB confirmed its recommendation at the May 25th council meeting, however, that they would settle in this matter if the compensatory mitigation payment was a one-time lump sum payment of $12 million. The CRMC staff respectfully disagree with the FAB's objection recommendation. In our view, $5.2 million in a lump sum payable to the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust, which use will be controlled by the fishing industry, is the preferred option in this case. The Vineyard Wind 1 project has recently received federal approval for their 800 megawatt wind farm, and it is expected that later this summer, Vineyard Wind will begin implementation of its mitigation agreement with the state of Rhode Island, which includes establishment of the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust. Once established by the FAB in consultation with CRMC staff, the trust will be a nonprofit entity controlled by the fishing industry and independent of the state of Rhode Island. Vineyard Wind will make the first payment into the trust within 60 days of financial close, again expected later this summer. Therefore, CRMC staff recommend the following two items. Number one, the council accept the developer's compensatory mitigation offer of a one-time lump sum payment of $5.2 million to be payable to the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust within 60 days of financial close on the South Fork Wind project. As a side note, we expect financial close on the South Fork project to occur in early 2022. The council should also require the developer to work with CRMC staff and legal counsel to enter into a binding agreement to implement this condition, and that the agreement be included with the state's federal consistency decision no later than June 22nd, 2021. Again, as a sidebar, the agreement implemented and executed between Vineyard Wind and the CRMC was completed on February 21st, 2019, and the council issued its concurrence, which included that agreement on February 28th. That mitigation agreement was included with the council's decision when issued on February the 28th. We are proposing the same action in this matter. Number two, the council issue a conditional concurrence pursuant to the federal consistency regulations at 15 CFR, section 930.4, that includes the CRMC staff recommended, project minimization alternative for a maximum of 12 turbine foundations using the 11 megawatt turbine generator. The council must require the developer to file a letter with BOEM modifying its project and agreeing to the state's condition requiring the project minimization alternative pursuant to 15 CFR section 930.4 subsection A2 and file same with the CRMC prior to June 22nd, 2021, so it too can be included with the state's federal consistency decision. So in conclusion, it is the staff opinion with a reasonable degree of certainty based on the range of estimates of project impacts over the life of the South Fork Wind project, all the facts presented and the materials reviewed in this matter, that with the council required project minimization alternative of no more than 12 turbine foundations, the compensatory mitigation as recommended herein, combined with all other mitigation elements put forth by the developer that the South Fork project meets all the enforceable policies of the ocean SAM. And in speaking of the mitigation requirements under the enforceable policies, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, also known as BOEM, is the lead federal permitting agency for offshore wind projects. Under the South Fork Construction and Operation Plan, BOEM may approve up to 15 turbine foundations, which would result in the maximum impact to the coastal resources. However, the CRMC proposed project minimization alternative will reduce overall impacts to glacial moraine, as fewer foundations and inter-array cable would be installed. The alternative will reduce construction impacts from pile driving, cable trenching and installation, and the placement of scour protection and secondary cable protection within glacial moraine. Thus, the project minimization alternative allows the CRMC to conclude that all feasible efforts have been made to avoid damage to the glacial moraine resources and values. So with that, Madam Chair and council members, I will conclude and be happy between Jeff and myself to answer any questions the council may have.
Madam Chair, may I ask a question? I'm
Yes.
sorry. No, I
Yes,
defer to
Mr.
you, Madam Chair.
No, go ahead, Mr. Sahajan. I was going to ask if anyone had questions.
Oh, okay. Mr. Boyd, you indicated you were familiar with the negotiations regarding Vineyard Wind.
Yes, sir.
Okay, and did you participate in those negotiations?
I did not participate in the direct negotiations. That was handled by former executive director Grover Fugate and legal counsel.
But you're familiar with the outcome of those negotiations. And I guess my question is, do you think this offer is fair and similar to the negotiations conducted with Vineyard Wind?
What I would say is that we tried to get the best possible mitigation deal here as part of the overall mitigation package for this particular project.
Okay.
We
And
were
then-
not successful, unfortunately, in getting an agreement that all the parties could agree to.
Okay. And then during the process where you tried to advance these negotiations, was everything on the record, or was everything with the knowledge of both parties?
Everything that was presented during the three-party negotiations, and then when CRMC staff held individual meetings with both South Fork and the FAB, we did share with all the parties all the information that was supplied to us in a timely manner.
Okay, so neither side can indicate that there were secret backroom deals.
There were no secret backroom deals.
Okay, because one of my concerns is, you know, we're being scrutinized by the media, and there are objectors, and the attorney for the FOB indicated at the last meeting
Correct.
that she felt there were secret backroom deals, and you still feel confident that everything was out in the open. Both sides were notified of, you know, what the other side was thinking and what was represented and what was presented to them and to us.
Yes, I would say there certainly was some obfuscation of facts during the entire negotiation proceedings over several months, but the facts all did get out.
So between you and Executive Director Willis, everything was conveyed to both sides.
That is correct.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Madam Chair, Ray Coya,
Mr. Koya.
I got a question to the chair and our council. My understanding is May 25th, when we had our last meeting, staff presented a conditional concurrence with a payment of $12 million over 30 years, reduction from 15 to 12 turbines. And that's what was on the table. My understanding is the FAB did not agree to that, did not accept that. Matter was continued from that night till tonight. A motion was made that night to request that they continue negotiating, and that failed. So we come before us tonight with another staff recommendation, bringing the 12 million down to 5.2 million payable all at once. So my question is, how did we get here? How did we get another, I mean, I know what it is from what Jim said and that it's been presented to us, but how was it that the parties got back together and now we've got a new figure coming before us? Did Orsted call CRMC and ask to come back to the table? Because I'm kind of curious how it happened when the last thing, when we left on the last hearing was there was no mandate that they continue negotiating. And now what we have before us tonight is a different conditional concurrence, different because of the dollar amount. And it's my understanding that the FAB is not in agreement with this one as well. So we went from 12 million down to 5.2 million. And I'm not seeing or following that that was at the request of the developer Orsted. So I guess that's in a question form, but with a statement.
Madam-
As, yes, Mr. Willis,
Sure, I can, if you don't mind, Madam Chair.
go ahead.
Mr. Koya, the meeting was held at my request as part of our continuing meetings that we have had with both parties. I had noticed that the disbursement issue was still an issue that I had many questions for. So I asked both parties to come together to figure out the best way to disperse the $12 million over 30 years. And that's where it was learned that in any fashion, the 12 over 30 could be dispersed, that the developer was willing to look at any number of ways to do that. In the end, in the meeting, the representatives for the FAB just weren't interested in a schedule where $12 million over 30 years was the number. They were not authorized to discuss those types of issues. So it was upon my recommendation that what we felt as staff, a 12 million over 30-year schedule might be better served to the fishing community as a one lump sum payment put into their viability trust that they can manage as they see fit over the course of the life of the project. So in the end, it's still it's what the net present value is of $12 million today. That's nothing has changed in terms of the compensation number. It's just how it's dispersed.
Okay. Thank you for that answer.
Any other questions? Mr. Gomez?
Yeah, and I don't know how deep we want to go in at this time, but the present value method, I know the FAB probably doesn't like that, but it's a very legitimate exercise on deciding what the value of that money is today and taking it up front. And then I believe the vineyard payout was somewhere around 2 million. So it looks like in the very near future, the FAB would be getting over $7 million to put into a trust, which is one of the things they wanted was a trust. So I don't have a lot of problems. I'm not settled in my mind yet, but I don't have a lot of problems with the process that you presented. The one question I think I have is that a couple of questions, but one is we are an east to west layout that we wanted, and we are 1 nautical mile, not 1.1, but 1. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Gomez.
And do we have the ability? We had a lot of problems, or a number of problems, with the Block Island wind farm, and we ended up with a CVA. Are we in a position to request a CVA on this? I know one of the problems with Block Island, it took a lot longer. There was a lot of cable lay problems. There was a lot of cement dropped on the bottom because they did not bury cables. I would suspect we're not in a position to request a CVA, but somebody
That's-
ought to think about it.
Well, you're absolutely correct, Mr. Gomez. The Block Island project was entirely, at least the turbines and most of the cabling was in state waters. So it was a state permit. And the CRMC was able to require a certification verification agent, a CVA. BOEM requires a CVA for all offshore wind projects conducted in federal waters. So a CVA will be on the South Fork and every other offshore wind project that BOEM may approve in the future. The CRMC cannot make that requirement because we are only reviewing this matter as a federal consistency matter because no portion of this project is in state waters.
With those reports that BOEM would require from a CVA, would they be made available to CRMC?
I believe that they would be, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just a point. I think it's needed and you've explained that one will be assigned. Although not from the state of Rhode Island.
Correct.
Other questions for Mr. Boyd? I have a question, Mr. Boyd, on the $12 million or $5.2 million in present value. I know we're not just looking at compensation. That's part of the mitigation package. But I'm trying to get an idea of what that $12 million would cover as far as percentage of estimated losses. And I understand there's a range, right? That I think in your original staff report, it was 15 million to 40 million, and that's 50% to 80% loss. So I'm trying, and that's their estimate. And I know that the developer has said, maybe up to 100% during the multi-month construction period, but then it's 5% after that. The $12 million is what percentage approximately of the lower end of the estimated losses?
Sure. I think the way to answer that, Madam Chair, is you're absolutely right. There is a range of estimates that we put together based on information that was provided by both the developer as well as the fab. And when we looked at commercial, charter, and recreational economic impacts as presented by both parties, and then we applied the fab estimated across the board 50 to 80% losses that they estimated during operation phases. And you're correct, it'll be 100% during construction period, which for this project, the COP states that it would be about an eight-month period. There's uncertainty there. There may be extensions beyond the 8 months just because of the difficulty of construction in the offshore environment. Again, speaking to the term uncertainty that I raised at the meeting last week. So the fab estimated 50 to 80% losses during operation. So if we apply those estimates at the lower end of 50% loss using the developer's numbers, it's about $15 million over 30 years. Using the fab's upper range and using their numbers at an 80% loss, it could be $40 million. But again, this is a range of estimates and there's a lot of uncertainty there. The developer offered a compensatory mitigation of $12 million over 30 years. And it was staff's opinion that for the benefit of the fishing industry, it would be best to take that in one lump sum, and in our opinion, put it into a vehicle, if you will, that will be established this summer and will be in place by the time South Fork Wind reaches financial close. This way, the fishing industry, which will control the Rhode Island Fisherman Viability Trust, there will be a board of trustees selected by the fishermen to operate and implement the trust. They will have monies initially put in by Vineyard Wind, and Vineyard Wind will then make 4 other consecutive payments. So they pay into the trust over a 5-year period, $2.5 million for each of the 5 years, for a total of $12.5 million at the end of the 5-year period. When South Fork closes, with our recommendation this evening, there would be $5.2 million in one lump sum payment in sometime in early 2022. So there will be monies there available for the fishing industry to determine how best to use those monies to take care of the fishing industry, whether it's to pay out claims by fishermen from losses during construction of either South Fork or Vineyard Wind. And in speaking of percentages, the 12 million over 30 years would potentially cover expected losses, but at less than 50% over the 30-year life. But again, this is the FAB's estimate of potential losses during the operational phase, which is 25 years, of between 50 and 80%. It could potentially be less than that. We just don't know. And the uncertainty here is we do not have any projects in the Northeast, with the exception of the 5 turbine Block Island project and 2 turbines that are in offshore waters off of the coast of Virginia. And until there are projects out there that we can continue to monitor for a period of time to understand what the range of potential impacts will be, how it's going to affect the fishing community, and how best the fishing community can adapt to the extent that it might be able to adapt, we won't know. And so our recommendation tonight is to further the fishing industry in determining its destiny in terms of how compensatory mitigation funds will be spent.
Yeah, I like the idea of an upfront lump sum payment because I was worried if there would, for example, be, each year an equal amount funded up to 30 years, that you might not have enough funds in the early years to cover anticipated losses. And I think both all parties have agreed that there's going to be impacts that are different given where you are on that spectrum of time, concentrated most seriously in the construction phase, and then probably in the first few years of operation. So that makes sense to me. And I also think you do need funds for the decommission stage, but that will be for the fishermen to determine how they preserve the funds for those future losses, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That would be correct. We believe it's in the best interest of the fishermen to control compensatory mitigation funds as they see fit to deal with any potential revenue losses during construction. And as you correctly point out, it is expected that the greatest impacts will occur during the construction phase, because there will be exclusion zones around each turbine foundation when it's constructed and when they're cabling, et cetera. And the noise impacts will likely very likely impact the fishery resources and the ability of the fishermen to catch in proximity to where construction activity is occurring and for quite a distance out. As we noted in our staff report, there is potential for behavioral effects on fish as much as almost 8 miles away from a turbine that is being driven into the seabed.
And then even after construction, it takes a period of time for fish to migrate back in, ecosystem to reestablish, and fishermen to adjust to a new way of fishing between the turbines.
Correct.
Okay. Speaking of the turbines, and we've talked about the reduction in the number of them from the 15 to 12, that's part of the recommended conditional concurrence. And you spoke to the reason why this would mitigate the impact because there would be less pile driving, less cabling, less scouring equipment. And there were some comments made at the last meeting about it not having a material effect. That's not, it will have a significant effect as I view it, based on what you've stated. Is that correct?
That's correct. Under the construction and operation plan, BOEM may approve up to 15 turbine locations for this project. That's what BOEM could approve. And so with the staff recommendation for no more than 12 turbine foundations, our project minimization alternative would ensure that there would be 3 less turbine foundations installed and the requisite cabling in between, which is 1 nautical mile of cabling between each of these turbines. Because remember, when these turbines are installed, they all have to be interconnected. And then that connects to an offshore substation, which is on a separate platform. And then the export cable emanates from the offshore substation to make landfall, in this case, on Long Island.
I think there may have been some discussion of, well, if you can't specify where you're going to take out those 3, then it doesn't help. Can you address that criticism and if we have any say on that?
Sure. In BOEM's draft environmental impact statement, there is a habitat minimization alternative. It contemplates the potential removal of turbine foundations if micrositing, and micrositing is the ability of the developer under BOEM's regulations, if they have a difficult pile location, they have the ability under BOEM's regulations to move that pile within a 500-foot radius from the identified position in the COP and still meet BOEM's requirements without having to resubmit a new project alternative to be reanalyzed. So the micrositing provides the developer the ability to avoid, if they can, glacial moraine in those instances where, let's say, a turbine location in its currently identified location is in glacial moraine, but yet 200 feet away, they would be outside of the glacial moraine. Well, that allows them to microsite. The habitat minimization alternative in the DEIS, again, contemplates potential removal of turbine positions that cannot be microsited and still maintain the required separation distances that the Coast Guard has recommended in its MARIPARS report. That's the Massachusetts Rhode Island Port Access Routing Study, which recommended the 1-by-1 nautical mile, north-south, east-west uniform grid for the entire 1,400 square miles of BOEM lease areas in southern New England waters. On the diagonals, it will be 0.7 nautical miles on the diagonals between any one turbine. And the Coast Guard wants to maintain that minimum distance for safe navigation, as well as to conduct search and rescue operations.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions. Thank you for the explanation. Does anyone else have follow-up questions for Mr. Boyd? Okay, if none, then I would ask if Mr. Moore can bring in counsel for both South Fork Wind and FAB, so they can have an opportunity to respond to the addendum. Hello, Ms. Main?
Hello, Chair Savinka. Hello, council members.
So I'll give you an opportunity to spend about 10 to 15 minutes, if you would, responding to the addendum and limiting the comments to the new elements of the conditional concurrence, if you will.
Certainly, thank you. And I will try to keep this as brief as possible. As you have heard tonight, South Fork has agreed to a $5.2 million upfront payment. And we have said all along, including at the last meeting, that we were flexible on how the $12 million over the life of the project will be paid. And so we are accepting of the 5.2 lump sum payment. And despite the vote last week, when we had the request from the executive director to meet yesterday, we attended that meeting and tried to work through the other elements here, including the funds. And I need to take you back. I need to take you back quite a few months. At the end of September of 2020, South Fork made its proposal. Part of that proposal included term sheets for a direct compensation fund and a community trust fund. We developed those programs with the assistance of Industrial Economics out of Massachusetts, who has expertise in developing funds. And to a certain degree, we followed what had been done in the past as far as having a direct compensation fund and a trust fund. But what was missing, and what was missing in particular from the Vineyard Wind approval, was a developed claims process. So South Fork took the additional step and with its term sheets dating back to September, outlined a claims process. So that was fully disclosed to those involved in that timeframe. And as you've heard tonight and last week, there were many mitigation meetings involving CRMC staff, South Fork, and the FAB. Those meetings became overshadowed by the mitigation number and the different elements of it, operational impacts, construction impacts, decommissioning impacts, and discussions about all of those elements. There were times when we attempted to talk about the funds. And again, it was overshadowed. Then, as we approached these meetings, and including last week, there was a discussion over how would this be put together. So last Friday, I submitted another letter to CRMC, it's dated May 28th, summarizing our funding mechanisms, which again is the claims process and the trust fund. We weren't able to talk about those elements yesterday. And so today around 2 p.m., I got the updated recommendation from the staff that Mr. Boyd talked about. What is troubling to me with this updated recommendation is not the $5.2 million upfront payment, but the fact that all of that money would go into a trust fund. And it's a trust fund that is a Vineyard Wind trust fund, a trust fund that hasn't been developed yet, a trust fund where there's no claims process. And so therefore, what my client would be missing is any release from having its funds, which are earmarked for mitigation, being paid out for a claim and not getting a release for it. If you go back and look at this Fisherman's Viability Trust, it doesn't have that mechanism for a claims process where we get a release. We, working with staff and trying to work with the FAB, came to that 12 million over the life of the project. Frankly, we never wanted to go that high. If you look at our prior proposals, Woods Hole analyzed project impacts, we added contingencies, and as a first project, we added more money to try to push this forward on mitigation. But never was the concept to put all the money in a trust where we don't get releases for that claim during the process. And as even Chair Savinka mentioned a few minutes ago, some needs to remain for decommissioning impacts. There's potentially impacts on that end. And I don't see how this trust mechanism would provide that. So we have concerns about it pouring over into this trust. Will there be an exhaustion of the money by the end? And frankly, I sat through those Vineyard Wind hearings. And the two things that still ring in my ears over that hearing are the fact that Vineyard was not on a 1-by-1 nautical mile grid. South Fork, as we explained last week, with Ørsted and Eversource, led the development community to go to that 1-by-1 nautical mile grid in order to mitigate against impacts. So that modification to the project was significant. And that's one of the reasons why when you talk about impacts here, we believe that the impacts have been truly minimized because of that 1-by-1. But the other thing that rings through my ears from that Vineyard Wind hearing was that the trust would be used as a war chest against the offshore wind industry. So here I am met at 2 p.m. today with this suggestion for a trust. And all of the money that we're willing to pay in upfront going into that trust with no claims process established with releases for us, the potential for exhaustion of the funds, being tied to another developer in some way, and also this concern about a war chest. And I understand that this trust hasn't even been written up yet. There's only agreement to develop this trust, but these are our concerns. We revert, and we would like you to revert to what our original proposal was, which is a claims process with funding for that claims process and certainly money for a trust. And if you want certain of our 5.2 to be earmarked into the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust, we're willing to do that. Again, we'll work it out with CRMC staff and whatever part Vineyard Wind may play in this. And we'll certainly put money into that trust. Again, we don't want it being used as a war chest, but we're willing to work and comply with part of the element of this recommendation with the trust. But what we're not willing to give up is a claims process where we give a release and also some assurance that money will be on the other end for decommissioning. And I think we can work that out with the good offices of Mr. DeSisto, as has been recommended with this staff additional addendum. But those are the concerns that we see with the overall mechanism with the trust. Keeping in mind as well that we will be setting up still separate and apart our radar fund. I don't want to lose sight of that. That's an important fund for equipment and for training. So that will be a separate fund that we still stand by and will set up. But South Fork needs the protection on the liabilities, as I've discussed before. Otherwise, what are we mitigating? We're supposed to be mitigating impacts, and we need to make sure that those monies are being spent to mitigate impacts and that we get releases. The other element of this recommendation from this afternoon that is an issue, though I think we can work through it, is that CRMC staff has requested that we file a letter with BOEM modifying our project, and they cite to a CFR provision. That CFR provision, 15 CFR section 934A2, is about amending COPs, construction and operation plans. We need that stricken because we do not need to amend our COP. So on May 21st, and then carrying through to the early part of next week, when we were faced with the staff recommendation of dropping turbine locations, we went to BOEM and we said, if we agree to drop those 3 locations, do we have to amend our COP? And we suggested that we did not have to, because our design envelope under the COP is up to 15 turbines. So there would be no need to amend the COP. BOEM agreed with us. They sent an email back to us that we do not need to amend the COP. I have already provided that email to Mr. DeSisto. And so we also asked that the second condition of today's addendum reflect that we do not need to amend the COP and that this provision of the CFR be stricken. One final point, it's been said several times tonight that the parties talked and that the parties are here and that the parties will present. With all due respect, let me remind everyone that the FAB is advisory to CRMC. The FAB plays an important role under the OSAMP in that advisory position, but the FAB is not a party here. We, the developer, are before CRMC on a federal consistency review. It is one step in a long process when we explained that to you last week. The FAB is not a party here, and I respectfully request that that issue be addressed here, in that I don't see, and we're already at 6:15 this evening, where there's more input that's needed or more lengthy input that's needed. Thank you, and I'm available if you have any questions.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Main? I think if we don't have questions, I do want to ask some questions of Mr. DeSisto and Mr. Willis or Mr. Boyd, but I would save it till after the FAB responds to the addendum, if that makes sense. Okay. DeSisto.
Evening.
Good evening.
Madam Chair, members of the council, thank you for having us again tonight. The FAB, Dr. Sproul and I all appreciated an opportunity to go over the specific details of the Ørsted mitigation package following the meeting last week. So thank you very much for that. However, there is a fundamental misunderstanding about what I'm calling the alleged $12 million over 30 years. We didn't have a ton of time to go over the information recently submitted by Ørsted, but we did go over it, both myself and Dr. Sproul. And it is clear to us that both the 12 million and the 5.2 million have severe and fatal economic flaws. The only reason I know this, because I'm not an economist, is because the qualified expert who is advising the FAB and also advising you, the council, explained it to me. Dr. Tom Sproul, who you are all familiar with, is the expert on the economics at play in this case, and we should all be relying on his expert opinion. Hearing from Ørsted's counsel tonight, it seems as though Orsted is objecting to the trust option that CRMC staff put forward because they want leftover money back and they also want a release. But as Dr. Sproul will explain, there's not going to be any money left very quickly following some initial rounds of claims by the fisheries user groups. And the fisheries user groups cannot sign a release because they're not going to be made whole by $5.2 million. What other recourse will they have if they are forced to sign a release? As I said last week, I know that the recommendation from staff may sound reasonable, but please hear us out on the economic piece. We don't think that the new recommendation follows the requirements of the ocean stamp, and we think the council should still be objecting to this project. Given all of that, I think it's best for Dr. Sproul to explain why the offer amounts have been misrepresented. So if it pleases the council and Madam Chair, could we request that Dr. Sproul be added as a panelist? And he knows he's only got about 10 minutes.
That's fine.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I saw Attorney Main's hand go up, so I'm not sure if she wanted to comment before that happened.
I would like to.
Ms. Main?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I object to turning this into, expert testimony over trusts. CRMC only has to look back at what it did with Vineyard Wind. It developed a direct compensation fund and it developed the Fisheries Viability Trust. That's all we're asking to do here. That's the only issue before us now. It is not a discussion over the money. The new issue before us today is whether it goes into a direct compensation fund and a trust or not. And we would like to follow the model of a direct compensation fund and a trust. So I object to more testimony over numbers here.
I understand your comments. I've asked the parties to limit their comments to the new elements set forth in the addendum. So I would just ask Mr. Sproul that you attempt to do that as opposed to retread on matters that we've already been through at the last meeting. So with those limitations, I'm comfortable hearing you now. And again, if you can keep your testimony to under 10 minutes.
Madam Chair, Ray Coyer, before he begins.
Yes.
I did not think that we were allowing witnesses. Attorney Main testified as an attorney, she spoke as an attorney representing the developer. And I thought we were going to let Attorney Desautels speak as it relates to the FAB. I think this is opening up a back and forth because once we let this gentleman speak, Attorney Main, then we'll say, well, I want someone to speak relative to that. And then we're going to call Jeff again, Jim again, Tony again, going back into the discussions. So I don't think it's proper. If it's proper, I'd object to it. I just don't think we need to keep calling more witnesses on that particular issue.
Okay, I'll just ask Ms. Desautels to respond to that, to both Ms. Main and Mr. Koya's comments. And then I'll ask you, Mr. DeSisto, if we need to take a vote on that.
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair and council members. The FAB is an advisory board to the council. So our role at this point is to make sure that everyone understands the economics of what's actually being proposed. Now, if you feel confident that you understand it, you're better than me because I am not an economist. That's why we elected to have Dr. Sproul speak tonight in a very limited capacity. He can explain to you why the 12 million over 30 years is not actually that. So the 5.2 million is not actually 5.2 million. That is all he's going to explain to you. We're not talking about the trust. We're not talking about any other element other than that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. DeSisto?
Okay, the difficulty I see here is that, the presentations were from last week and then it was closed. And what the chair, what you've allowed now is for the attorneys to respond to the, what the Mr. Boyd had to say on this. And now what we have is the FAB, which is the advisory group to CRMC. Essentially, this is testimony, additional testimony. And, on the other side, the applicant was not allowed to do that. I think what you need to have here is the statement and the argument from Ms. Desotel that there's issues with it. And FAB doesn't agree with it and thinks that there's problems with the numbers as they're relayed. But, we're getting into that situation that I think Vice Chair Coy is talking about. You have one party that is allowed to present an expert witness and the other party wasn't. And then all of a sudden now we've reopened what we did last week that when it was closed. And it's getting farther and farther away from the purpose of this meeting, which was to hear from the public. So I think the statement that FAB still objects, as Ms. Desotel said, thinks there's problems with the numbers, as she said, and she can make her argument from there is sufficient. But, if the council wants to do otherwise and you want to take a vote, that's fine.
Yeah, I understand that's probably fair that we limit it to council. I just asked Ms. Desatel if you need to confer with Dr. Sproul so that you can represent the summary of what he would otherwise be talking about.
Yes, because as I said before, I'm no economist. And so I don't feel comfortable right now trying to explain what he was going to talk about.
Okay, Mr. DeSisto, could we go to public comment and then come back to this point so that Ms. Desatel can finish up with her summary?
Okay.
I don't want to lose time and while she's conferring with him. Again, if you can come back and, be between 5 and 10 minutes, that'll probably be about equal amount of time as we gave to Ms. Main. And I think at this point I wanted, well, first of all, are there any questions that people have about what Ms. Main or what Ms. Desatel has said so far? Any questions we want to ask Mr. Boyd, Mr. DeSisto? Okay, and we can do that, again, during deliberations. So I wanted to take a 5-minute break because I just have to assess how many members of the public are going to want to speak. And it's 6:22 right now, so let's come back at 6:27. And, you just remain on the Zoom, but you can mute and turn off your cameras if you want. Thank you. I understand that we have 23 individuals who have virtually signed up to speak. And based on that number, we're going to limit the comments to 3 minutes each. And that'll take us to approximately 70 minutes, a little over an hour. And Mr. Moore, I just have a partial list from last time, so I'm going to ask you to be the one to call out the name of the person speaking, admit them to the meeting, and then when the 3 minutes is close to being up, somewhere like 30 seconds before that, if you could indicate that if they're still speaking.
Can do.
Thank you.
First up is Jerry Edens.
Jerry, can you raise your hand, please?
I'm trying to allow them, but
I just see,
there they go.
yep, good.
Ms. Edens, we can't see you or hear you. And if you're having technical difficulty, we can come back to you. Please use the chat box if that's the case. Okay, Mr. Moore, can you take her off and we'll come back to her.
Next would be David Monty.
Madam Chair, can you hear me? Is everyone?
We can hear you and see you.
My name is Dave Monty, and I am a charter captain and an angler from Rhode Island. I'm a board member of the American Saltwater Guides Association, second vice president of the Rhode Island Saltwater Anglers, and vice chair of the Rhode Island Marine Fisheries Council. I'm also a member of the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program Steering Committee and a member of the Rhode Island Party and Charter Boat Association. I'm a fishing writer for 15 blogs, newspapers, and fishing magazines, and weekly solicit input from thousands of anglers and charter captains, bait and tackle shop owners, industry experts, as well as fishing and the boating public to write my weekly column. I thank CRMC, the FAB, and South Fork Wind for proposing and working on this project. Without it, we would miss out on badly needed renewable energy. The fish I catch today as a charter captain are vastly different in type and abundance than what I caught 10 years ago due to climate change impacts. As you know, all the cold water fish have left. The winter flounder, the American lobster have moved out, and the warm water fish have moved into the area, such as scup and black sea bass. The fishing industry, both commercial and recreational, need renewable energy to help stem the tide on the negative climate impacts. South Fork has acknowledged the importance of private recreational fishing and has reached outside to recreational anglers with leader interviews, surveys, fishing hour workshops, fishing representatives, and meetings. Recreational anglers are supportive of offshore wind as long as wind farms are developed responsibly, and that would be with research before, during, and after construction to measure any positive, negative impacts. South Fork Wind Farm is being responsibly developed with an aggressive research and monitoring plan in place that recreational fishers, just like me, and commercial fishermen on the FAB help develop. This research and monitoring plan is in the area of a number of different surveys, including gillnet, fish trap, beam trawl, pot surveys, acoustic telemetry, and biological cod and pelagic fish studies. It is a robust fisheries research and monitoring plan, the kind that every wind farm should have. And yes, I say you need plans like this to measure negative impacts and positive impacts. Because I and other anglers believe that offshore wind farms will have a major positive impact on habitat and fish. A peer-reviewed meta-analysis of multiple fish abundance studies in European wind farms relates greater fish abundance inside offshore wind farms than outside in control areas. And at the Block Island wind farm, recreational fishing there is good, perhaps a bit better, even though fishing pressure has increased by over 200%. You know, when I would fish there before the wind farm, if you were there any given summer day, there might be 4, 8, 9 boats. Now some days, believe it or not, on heavy weekends, there are 100 boats up fishing there. Fishing there now includes large striped bass and bluefish, in addition to scup, black sea bass, and nearby fluke and cod, which is commonly caught in the area as well as in other areas outside of Cox Ledge. Spear fishermen who belong to the Rhode Island saltwater anglers actually dive on the pylons, and it's a great place to spear large striped bass and sea bass and even tautog. And rod and reel anglers are using eels, dropping them at the wind farm to catch large striped bass. So it's attracting a number of different species. And at Block Island, as you know, there are gill nets set right up to the wind farm. There are trawlers that trawl parallel to it. There are commercial and recreational rod and reel fishermen fishing right in the wind farm. In my opinion, fishing should be enhanced at Cox Ledge too, with enhanced reef effect. The reef effect of foundations and associated scour protection will have a major positive impact on fishing in the South Fork area, just as it has done at Block Island and in European wind farms. Additionally,
Mr. Monty, Mr.
Yeah.
Monty, you're over your time, so if you can sum up in a few seconds.
Sure. To
be
summarize, I reject the idea that fishing will be worse at South Fork. It was likely to be better. More fish is a good thing, both for recreational and commercial fishes. So I find it hard to ask for compensation when most recreational fishing will be better during operations. I understand negative impacts during construction, and there should be compensation for that. And fishermen should be compensated, but existing science and experience tells us that long-term negative impacts will most likely not occur, but rather be positive impacts. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Monty.
Next would be Scott Duhamel.
Sorry about that, eating into my precious 3 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. It was a pleasure to hear Mr. Monty's testimony. Heretofore, we've heard a whole lot about mitigation. Oh, excuse me, I'm Scott Duhamel. I am the Secretary Treasurer of the Rhode Island Building and Construction Trades. I am an executive board member of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO. I am an international rep for the Painters Union, and I'm someone, along with many others, who was intricately involved in the original Block Island project. As I said, it was a pleasure to hear the prior testimony. We've heard a whole lot about mitigation, miniaturization, mitigation, the reduction of the turbines from 15 to 12, celebrated as a victory by some, is viewed as a true hurtful loss by others, including those I represent. It's an undeniable fact that we're entering into a brave new world. It's a gateway to pass our over-reliance on fossil fuels. We all know that. But let's look at this at the lens of Rhode Islanders and Rhode Island workers. This is the beginning of a new industry. We're in the center of it. Our position, our location, our ports, our prior experience with Block Island Wind Farm puts us in a unique way. Of course, this will benefit the people I represent, the unionized construction workers, and it'll benefit the Rhode Island contractors that they work for. But if we look further, there's an opportunity for an ancillary market. There's an opportunity for businesses, for mom and pops, to be part of the food chain for the wind industry. Once again, I'll restate myself. Rhode Island's in a unique position to take hold of this and move on. There's a lot of opportunities out there. It's really bright, shiny opportunities. And I think it's time that we make a hard and right decision to look at the future, to see what this could develop into and be among the first in our nation and be in a unique place on the East Coast to be the center of this action. And there's a chance, and we're pushing for it. This is going to bring back manufacturing, something that everybody knows there's a dearth of in America. And we could also be part of that manufacturing chain. That's really essential to think about. So I would urge everyone to make this decision promptly. Every minute we slow down, every minute this is delayed, it hurts the project and also hurts the chances of Rhode Island positioning itself in a unique place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Duhamel.
Next, we have Michael Sabatoni.
Here we go. Good evening. I'm sorry I cut into my 3 minutes as well. Can you hear me all?
We can.
Madam Chair, members of the council, my name is Michael Sabatoni. I am president of the Rhode Island Building and Construction Trades Council. I'm also the business manager of the Rhode Island Laborers District Council, both two entities representing almost 20,000 workers in and around the state of Rhode Island. And just as full disclosure, I'm also the president and chairman of Rhode Island Resource Recovery Corporation. So I know what it's like to sit in this chair or your chair and make tough decisions on the future of the state with tough issues such as this going forward with the emotion that's wrapped around it. But there comes a point in time where we need to make decisions, and that's why you all are sitting on this council so that we can move our agenda forward. Now, I've heard words over the last couple of hearings of certainty, uncertainty, impacts. Well, let me give you the certainty that I know and the impacts. Climate change is a certainty. Energy is not an easy subject or process. We have an aging grid in Rhode Island, and we have less generating capacity as we go forward. Our ability to cite other traditional generating capacity, not only in this state, but in this region, has become even more and more difficult. We have a fragile grid. Example, the Aquidneck Island in Newport, what they went through a few years or so ago, with our inability to get gas at the end of the pipeline because of the difficulties of traditional energy. And offshore wind is our future. We've embraced it. We have members every day that get displaced in the traditional energy market. They employ a lot of our members in the traditional energy industry. And we've embraced the renewable concept to create, as my colleague, Mr. Duhamel mentioned, the new industry, the future. You're also seeing in the paper, and you've seen the announcements of various pieces of legislation, not only in Rhode Island, but in the Northeast that have been passed about very aggressive goals for us to meet our renewable future and mitigate our emissions. And in this area of the country, there's only one way that we're going to be able to do that and supply the energy needs of this area of the country, and that is offshore wind. And they do create good paying jobs. I've had firsthand knowledge because I was the one that negotiated the project labor agreement and shepherded the Block Island Wind Farm through the PUC, through the legislature, and saw the impact of the 300 jobs that were created to just build 5, and the supply chain and the business opportunities that came with it. I know this is not an easy decision, but at some point, 30 meetings, difference of opinions back and forth. That's why you all have been appointed to sit on a board such as this. If leaders made easy decisions, everyone would be one. I don't think this is a tough decision. As a matter of fact, I think this is a very good decision. And I also think that going forward, and I negotiate for a living. If you have both sides that aren't quite happy, you probably did the right thing in mitigating a resolution between two parties that were real far apart. But I would suggest this as well. We need the approval of the federal consistency for this South Fork project. We need to get going. We are in a very precarious situation right now with the energy needs in this state and the energy needs of the future. And I trust that with your vision and courage, you will make the right decision and move our agenda and the agenda for all Rhode Islanders. And quite frankly, across this country, set the example for us to get to our renewable future, create the jobs. And I do think we will absolutely coexist with the fishermen. I represent blue collar workers, and I know how hard it is to be out there and provide food and sustenance for the citizens of Rhode Island and the entire country. I also know and believe in my heart that we can coexist and we can do this correctly with your vision and your courage. And I thank you for your time and the ability to speak with you here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sabatoni. And just so everyone knows, Mr. Moore, when the speaker has reached 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Mr. Moore will have his virtual hand showing in his screen. So that's your cue as a speaker that you should be wrapping up within the next 30 seconds. Okay, Mr. Moore, we're ready for our next speaker.
That would be Joe Walsh.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good evening. My name is Joe Walsh, and I am the business manager for the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local Union 99 out of Cranston, Rhode Island. I represent 800 women and men, craft workers that labor every day in the electrical industry in Rhode Island. They live and work in all 39 cities and towns in the state of Rhode Island. Local 99 has been developing the renewable energy sector in Rhode Island for well over a decade. There are obvious positive impacts to the economy through gainful employment, through the embracing of burgeoning technologies, but our local union also recognizes that equally as important is the need to move forward to a renewable energy world for a sustainable future for the children of our children. Under the leadership of President Biden and also the leadership of the State of Rhode Island General Assembly, there's a clear and certain directive for the nation and more locally, the great state of Rhode Island to address the climate change reality and march towards the goal of a 100% renewable world, which is in the not too distant future. The South Fork Wind Project assists in just that. It is critical that all renewable energy projects are addressed as seriously as the impact of climate change on the world that is changing right before our very eyes. Renewable energy is not just about saving our planet. It's about saving humankind and all living creatures that move upon the earth, in the sky, and in the waters. When critical projects such as this are proposed, it is essential that people such as yourself evaluate all the different potential benefits or perceived undesirable impacts. And I certainly understand that. And I have several pages of studies and documentation, which I'm going to obviously skip with my 3 minutes, so I don't bore you out of your seats. So I will say this, the creation of the projects such as South Fork Wind offer our future generations a fighting chance against the implacable wrath of Mother Nature. Offshore wind, in and of itself, presents a reasonable and manageable impact that will be dwarfed by the benefits of reducing CO2 in a clean, safe, and majestic project such as this. Whereas our nation often lags far beyond the rest of the developed world in projects such as this, we are still in the it's too new phase, where every coffee shop scientist thinks they have their own rigid positions. As we speak of venturing into the ocean past just the 6 existing wind turbines in the United States of America, the rest of the developed world have installed well over 5,000 offshore wind turbines as the greatest nation in the world struggles to get past 0.12%. Changing the way we generate power is a global challenge, not simply in a neighborhood one. When electricity is generated, the power goes into the nationwide electrical grid. It matters little when the power lands. It only matters what fuel or lack of fuel was burned to create that energy. The goals are, of course, to have all states and all waters creating clean, renewable energy in the next 10 to 40 years. The facts are, these projects are being built successfully in a worldwide nation. And thankfully, the fears of negative impacts that any of us could easily imagine simply have not been realized. I believe it is also critical to understand that every career is changing and that is nothing new. As a professional master electrician, my career changed drastically from the days when my father toiled in the trade. The hours it took and the materials required to do a project was significantly reduced from one generation to another. And much of that very same work is now done offsite by others. I had to continually evolve in my craft, and I wished it was to stay viable. My industry will continue to change equally and drastically much faster, as it will be demonstrated in just the next few years. The person on the auto line will now be doing a much different job with electric vehicles. That requires many less man hours. They too must evolve. The cab driver, the accountant, the big rig driver, the doctor, the grocery clerk are all facing evolution or extinction. As much as I wish I could keep everyone's careers as they were in the days of our grandparents, that is simply not a luxury that we will ever be afforded. If we are truly serious about preserving the cornucopia that our planet offers as we know it today, then on behalf of the men and women of the IBEW Local Union 99, I respectfully request you approve the South Fork Wind Project, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
Next, we have Dave Langlis.
Am I on?
You are, and we can hear you and see you.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, council members. My name is David Langlis, and I am the business manager of the Ironworkers in Providence, Rhode Island. I represent over 500 members in Rhode Island and neighboring Massachusetts and Connecticut. Many of my members had the opportunity to benefit from the jobs that were created by the Block Island Offshore Wind Farm project, the first in the United States. Because of these opportunities, new training initiatives have come about to train a new workforce in this industry. This training is now being done all across the region to prepare for these upcoming projects. Offshore wind development is important to continuing to help the U.S. rely more on renewable energy sources and become less dependent on fossil fuels. With the concerns of warming and the changing climate, this is a terrific opportunity to do our part in working towards relieving some of those concerns. This important and valuable industry will create good paying jobs for men and women who have been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic and are still struggling to get back to pre-pandemic economic stability. Ørsted is committed to utilizing union labor on these projects as well as port infrastructure upgrades. This is evident by the fact that Ørsted and Eversource will be establishing a regional offshore wind foundation component manufacturing facility at the Port facility. This facility alone will help bring Rhode Island to the forefront of the offshore and renewable industry. My members, as well as our brothers and sisters from Connecticut and New York, are ready and eager to help in the continued development of this new and exciting industry being established in the United States. I strongly support the South Fork Wind Farm and ask that you approve this project. And I thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening.
Thank you, Mr. Langlis.
Next is Paul Barrett. I'm sorry.
Unmute, start video. Okay. Madam Chairman, Board, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, Paul Boudiette. I'm a recreational fisherman. I'm not a professional, as the previous speakers have appeared before you just now. Bear in mind, with due respect to all of them, they are speaking for personal gain, for financial gain. The testimony should be taken to that effect. I'm a recreational fisherman. I fish 2 or 3 days a week, weather permitting, at Cox Ledge. With my wife, we go there religiously. We love it. Of course, we understand that things have to change and that renewable energy is the future. However, picking the best fishing spot in Rhode Island area just offshore rather than moving to a spot that doesn't have all the fish, and there's plenty of it, baffles me. We've been told by Ørsted, well, you just fish elsewhere. Well, it's like if you took your favorite restaurant, they stuck a windmill in the middle of it, closed it. They said, go to McDonald's across the street. It doesn't quite cut it. It's a beautiful natural wildlife habitat that will be destroyed. The purpose of Worsted being here, with due respect, is, are they here to work with the fishermen? Yes. Are they here to promote green energy? Yes. What's the real reason they're here? It's to make money. That's the bottom line. And once they've made their money, they're not going to be babysitting the wind farm. They're going to be counting their money. As far as mitigation goes, I'm a businessman. I've been in many businesses by life. 12 million is a drop in the bucket. 5.2 million is laughable. In a couple of years of doing business, selling small products, we could do that kind of money. It's not a lot of money. And I really think it's insulting to be offering a mere 12 million. It's far from the real world out there and what damages could be. And besides, in 25 years, try and collect any money. I also haven't seen any evidence of at decommissioning. There's been talk about, well, okay, they'll take it down. Well, in 30 years, the life of the project is going to fall short, and I don't see that they'll be able to decommission it unless the CRMC has a bond in place that if they default and go bankrupt, which they're liable to do before then, otherwise we're going to have a Stonehenge at Cox Ledge, and they'll be there forever and ever and ever. So I really didn't see that much on the decommissioning. I'll keep myself brief. Again, Paul Boudiette, recreational fisherman, and thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Boutiette.
Next is Justin Kelly.
Yes, hello, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. My name is Justin Kelly, and I am a business representative for the Rhode Island Painters and Allied Trades, District Council 11. And I wanted to speak tonight in favor of the permitting and siting and allowance of this project for South Fork Wind Farm. And I want to talk a little bit about the experience of our members that worked on the Block Island Wind Farm project. We train our members to a very high standard that meets third-party engineering standards for industrial coatings and paint applications. And those men and women worked on the Block Island Wind Farm project. And let me tell you, when it was fundamentally transformational, I mean, it was fundamentally transformational. We watched individuals who came from a place of urban poverty, excuse me, pardon me, receiving a phone call, a place of living in urban poverty to being able to buy a house in the community that they grew up in, just from working on this one project. That was 5 turbines. So now extrapolating that into this larger project, we fully expect, and it is our expectation at the IUPAT, that this will create a large number of jobs for the industrial painters, not only the installation process, but as my colleague Scott Duhamel had alluded to, also in the manufacturing supply chain. And then, we honestly hope that these turbines will last a very long time offshore. And in that maintenance process, that work is something that we do. And we can ensure that those turbines will last out on the water. So again, we expect that there to be a sizable amount of high-paying, middle-class jobs created from this project and the others to follow. And I'm glad to take any questions, but we urge passage and approval.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Next, I have Mike Jarbo. Mike, can you raise your hand for me? Thank you.
Okay, we can see
I
you
mean-
and
all
hear
right.
you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the council. My name is Mike Jarbo with Save the Bay. Save the Bay was one of the many participants in the ocean SAMP process. We are proud of the hard work that was done in order to proactively prepare the state for the exact type of situation that we find ourselves in tonight. We submit that the council must uphold the enforceable policies set forth in the SAMP and find that the project is not consistent with the enforceable policies within it. The staff summary analysis makes an extremely strong case that the project is not consistent with the SAMP, but surprisingly, it concludes with the recommendation for conditional approval. The staff's recommendation is not supported by its own analysis. The extensive time and planning efforts undertaken by staff and stakeholders in the process of the SAMP are all for naught if the council does not uphold these enforceable policies. Save the Bay fully supports wind energy properly cited. However, based on the extensive analysis prepared by staff, the project is not properly cited, nor is it consistent with the ocean SAMP. The known and potential impacts to our coastal resources, including unique essential fish habitat from project construction, installation, operation, and decommissioning, are irreversible. As currently constituted, the proposal is not consistent for two main reasons. First, as stated by staff, the location of the South Fork Wind Project on Cox Ledge is, in our view, the worst possible location within Rhode Island Sound. We agree. While we understand there are risks of habitat loss to meet wind energy goals, this project will disrupt some of the most valuable habitat in Rhode Island Sound. For example, Cox Ledge is one of the few remaining places in the Sound where Atlantic cod are found at all life stages. While all fish habitat is important, spawning and nursery areas are especially important for providing shelter for these species during their most sensitive times in their life cycles. CRMC staff have determined that despite modifications to the proposed project, the project will have adverse impacts on our coastal resources and uses. Secondly, and finally, the applicant reconfigured the lease, precluding alternative locations without opportunity for Rhode Island's input. As stated again by staff, Orsted created their own hardship when they segregated the lease area from a much larger lease during BOEM's ongoing DEIS process. This eliminated the feasibility for alternative to relocate the turbine foundations to avoid damage to the glacial moraine and resources found on Cox Ledge. Simply put, the applicant should not be rewarded for reconfiguring the lease area, knowing that CRMC wanted the project located outside the glacial moraine. If the council certifies the project as consistent, it will make a mockery of the process and the ocean SAMP, set a dangerous precedent, and validate a playbook for other developers to leverage. It's the council's duty to uphold these enforceable policies, and the staff's expert analysis provides overwhelming evidence for denial, not nearly enough to justify a consistency determination. To conclude, Save the Bay submits that the project is not consistent with CRMC's federally approved coastal management program, even with the recommended conditions. This might be the correct project, but is certainly not the correct location. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Jarbo.
Next, I have Pat Crowley.
Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Patrick Crowley. I am the Secretary Treasurer of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO. On behalf of the 80,000 working women and men of the Rhode Island labor movement, we are in support of the proposal before you tonight, and we urge you to move it forward. You've heard from my brothers in the building trades and the excellent work that they are doing, both on the current wind projects that are already in operation, but also in the steps that they are taking to do their part to make sure that Rhode Island and the entire New England community takes the steps necessary to transition in a just way to a green economy. The men and women of the Rhode Island building trades have done heroic work in moving our economy in a direction that will meet both 21st century labor standards and a just economy built upon new sustainable means of powering our workforce. their testimony was powerful, and I hope you give it the weight that it deserves, as I know you will. So on behalf of the working men and women of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, thank you for your time tonight, and we urge you to support the proposal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crowley.
Next is Gary Yerman.
Mr. Yearman, we can't see you or hear you. You'll need to unmute yourself and turn on your video. There you go.
There we go. Yeah, good evening. My name is Gary Yearman. I've been a commercial fisherman for 49 years. My son, also a fisherman, and I own New London Seafood Distributors, a New London-based seafood unloading facility for 31 years. As a fisherman, I've worked these waters for years. I'm very protective of the livelihood of my fishermen, and I wouldn't support something that risks our fishing fleets. I was just as skeptical as any fisherman in the beginning. It took years of research and constant meetings with Ørsted before I could support this project. At first, I thought fishermen would be completely shoved aside for these developments. Instead, Ørsted and Eversource engaged with us to hear us out, hear our concerns, both in meetings and in writing. I'm skeptical about those who say they've been ignored by offshore wind. That has not been the case in our experience. 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to see coexistence between fishing and offshore wind firsthand in Kilkeel, Northern Ireland. I saw a successful fishing industry that grew alongside offshore wind. I also spoke with fishermen who were veterans of their areas. They were skeptical at first as well, but they recognized the opportunity and found success and stability because of it. We had the opportunity to do a pilot contract with Ørsted last year. What we found was an opportunity to supplement our fishing work and bring more stability to our fishermen. Future work with offshore wind will allow fishermen to go fishing when profitable and work their vessels with offshore wind, rounding out their bottom line. Ørsted and Eversource have already shown that they want to work with local businesses and fishermen. Every fishing community will find new opportunities available, stimulating the local labor force and economy. Ørsted is the largest wind developers in the world. They got there by having safety standards above international marine safety standards. Fishing vessels that are picked to work with Ørsted must meet these standards before they go to work. One Ørsted safety inspector explained to me, even though we're a big company, every single person working for us, safety and training leads to less accident. That is their goal. I've had the opportunity to participate in one of Ørsted's simulators in Middletown, Rhode Island recently. Having been in the wheelhouse of large offshore trawlers for the past 40 years, my virtual experience sailing in an offshore wind farm proved it's easier to navigate than many major waterways. At 1 nautical mile apart, wind farm spacing is wider than the Thames River channel, where I have to watch out for submarines and ferries coming and going at night in a pea soup fog. Fishermen are professional mariners used to working in close proximities with other vessels on a regular basis. The wind farm spacing at 1 nautical mile is much closer than in Europe, and the fishermen there amongst the wind farms, they navigate amongst the wind farms with very little difficulty. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm in favor of the wind farms.
Thank you, Mr. Yearman.
Thank you.
Next, I have James McKenzie on behalf of Gordon Bedell.
Good evening, council members, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is James McKenzie, and I'm here today to speak on behalf of Sea Services North America. Sea Services negotiates scout and safety vessel contracts for local fishermen to create job opportunities to support offshore wind projects. Gordon, our CEO, regrets he's unable to attend this evening as he had last week to share his comments. He has his daughter's high school graduation this evening. After years of vetting the facts and understanding the national need to adopt renewable energy solutions, Sea Services and our partner Fisherman, some of whom already spoke this evening, want to voice our full support for the South Fork Wind Project and the economic potential it brings to Rhode Island and the commercial fishing industry. I want to respond directly to a comment made earlier by Deputy Director Boyd, in which it was stated that periods of construction would have the greatest impact on commercial fishermen. Sea Services would argue this is also the periods of greatest economic opportunity for these fishermen, as offshore wind developers are going to need to work with local, knowledgeable fishermen who know these waters for scout and survey work, as well as other contracts that we have yet to anticipate. Sea Services has actually been fortunate to already do work with Ørsted specifically to support offshore wind and create these economic opportunities. Last summer, as Gary just mentioned, Sea Services was hired to perform scout work for an Ørsted survey team. We're proud to report that not only did our boats perform seamlessly, because of the partnership, there were 0 incidents of equipment strikes, which is unheard of in this industry. While working with the offshore wind developer, there were no problems, and we've already secured a second contract. So just further example of economic opportunity. What's been described by opponents of this project is not remotely the experience Sea Service had just last year. Ørsted is filled with people who are trying to build a relationship with commercial fishermen, and we've only found opportunity, growth, and stability in working collaboratively with them. That said, as Gary had just mentioned, Sea Services was founded by skeptical fishermen who wanted to protect our waters. To learn more, Gordon and several other future founders of Sea Services met with fishing communities in Europe to speak directly with fishermen who have been working with offshore wind developers for years. What they found was a remarkable story of growth, stability, and financial freedom for those who work to build an environment of coexistence with offshore wind. This experience is completely contrary to the uncertainty that others described last Friday. We have the opportunity to work with the best offshore wind developers in the world to build new opportunities for our industry, our community, and our families. We cannot afford to lose this opportunity to misinformation. And it was ironic to hear last week that environmental arguments were being made against a renewable energy project being built by one of the greenest companies in the world, according to Forbes. Sea Services can't strip away all of the misinformation or red herrings that are out there right now. But we do want to address one example that was given last week that worked to create problems rather than seek solutions. The 1 mile turbine distance was compared to a telephone pole being placed in the middle of a 2-lane highway, or earlier this evening, in the middle of a restaurant. While it's true that adding any element to open water creates an obstacle, there's a decade of data on fishing vessels working safely in smaller project areas around the world. And by smaller, I mean tighter, less than an nautical mile. We're surprised that the comment was made without putting it in the proper perspective. Standard 2-lane highway, according to interstate highway standards, is 24 feet wide, not including emergency lanes or physical dividers. With an average car width of 6 feet, that means 2 passing cars would take up about 50% of the transit space. In this offshore wind farm, the turbines will be a nautical mile apart, or roughly 6,000 feet, roughly. The largest ship in the world is 223 feet wide. If 2 of these massive vessels were to pass each other in the wind farm, they'd take up 7.4% of the transit space. That's pretty different from the 2-lane highway analogy. I'd also add that this is using the example of the largest ships in the world. If you're using a standard commercial fishing boat at 30 feet wide, it would take about 1% for both of the transit space for both of them to pass each other. Sea Services thinks that 99% of navigation area is enough room for our seasoned fishermen. Plus, cars don't have state-of-the-art navigation equipment and don't travel at only about 10 miles an hour. Arguments can be made about weather, manning, seas, but this language is counterproductive to bringing people together and trying to accomplish the same things that have already been accomplished in fishing communities in Europe. Ørsted and Eversource have worked hard to inform, reduce impact, and create opportunities for commercial fishermen. And none of this would be possible without the support of the JV, and their efforts to coexist should be acknowledged rather than indiscriminately attacked. Sea Services believes that now is the time to set aside the rhetoric and find creative solutions to coexistence. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak this evening, and Sea Services is in favor of South Fork Wind and building a collaborative future for the offshore wind industry and our local fishermen.
Thank you, Mr. McKenzie.
Next, I have Frederick Matera.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman and CRMC Council for this opportunity. My name is Fred Matera. I started fishing in 1972, so I've been in this industry for 49 years. I was a commercial fisherman for 40 years. I'm president of the Point Club, which is a mutual insurance group covering now insuring over 50 vessels here in Rhode Island and Southern New England. I'm a U.S. Coast Guard Marine Safety Instructor, president of the Commercial Fisheries Research Foundation, and executive director of Commercial Fisheries Center, representing 9 fishing associations. I'd just like to start off to just make some comments about what I've just heard recently. And trust me, I have a tremendous amount of respect for union leaders. I've met Mike and some of the others for a long time, but this is for personal prosperity. And, you know, my concern is that you're not looking and facing the livelihoods that are jeopardized into the future. And let me also just make a point. I've been out to sea for a lot of years, and I will tell you right now, those blue collar workers in the trade that will go out to the turbines, I'll guarantee 50 to 60% of them will be so seasick they won't be able to do their jobs. So there's a lack of that, and that's a concern. Sea Surf, excuse me, is an excellent company. I've known Gary for many years and Mike, but when that last gentleman spoke about what happens, 100% of the industry will be shut down during construction, he's talking 1 to 3 vessels that may be doing some scout and monitoring. That's not the hundreds of vessels that will be participating out there. So I just want to reflect on that. I want to go back and just using my 40 years of experience and say that fishing operations in and around the area will be altered for the entire life of the project, possibly after. There will undoubtedly be navigational challenges traveling through this area without proper transit lanes. 1 nautical mile east, west, north, and south does not provide adequate space for this large number of mariners traveling through this area. Many of these mariners will also be traveling from northwest to southeast on a diagonal of 0.7 nautical miles. That last gentleman talked about, you know, wind farms all over the world, and that, you know, there weren't issues. They didn't have problems. Well, they don't have problems because they're not allowed to steam or fish in and around those turbine sites. The only place, especially in the North Sea, that allows it is the UK. And as I'll go on and explain that, I have been a director for the 2nd largest marine insurer in the world, and that's from the UK. And I've been there for 21 years as a director, representing the United States on their board. I have been all over the UK visiting fishermen. And I'm sorry, but all the fishermen I spoke to, they didn't have positive statements. They basically said, don't do what we did. You know, make certain you get the right compensation and mitigation problem. Make certain you can, you know, these sites are bigger and they're further apart. The fishermen that have done the research there, the fishermen that have fished on those grounds refuse and won't go back. They don't go back to those grounds because of fear of collisions and everything else and limited spacing. So, you know, there are issues there, and they need to be addressed, and you need to hear it from those people that have dealt with it for many, many years. This Sunderland Marine that I represents 16,000 vessels spanning on every continent in the world. And believe me, I possess a profound understanding of measuring risk and its cost. There's no doubt that without wider transit lanes, mariners will experience numerous marine incidents causing excessive vessel damage and vessel loss and major injuries and loss of lives, triggering insurers to void coverage through exclusions in their policies, eliminating fishing and steaming through the Southwest Fork lease site. I'll give you a slight example. Woods Hole.
Mr. Matera, you are over your time, so if you can give us your example, wrap up, that'd be good.
Then I will finish with my last statement.
Okay.
And please understand that this issue may be perceived as controversial and contentious. However, it needs to be considered in a professional manner. The fishing industry is concerned that the CRMC staff recommendations do not match their analysis, which seems to suggest an objection. And the industry are concerned that this is because possible pressure, namely from NOAA and Dave Kaiser. It's particularly concerning that there was no discussion of removing turbines and a remedy during the mitigation process. And it defies logic that giving back several of the turbines from the developers doesn't change the recommended mitigation amounts. The staff needs to disclose in their recommendation if their recommendation is based on a fear of getting overturned on appeal. It should be CRMC councils making the decision that is best for Rhode Island, and they need to have the information to decide. The council can't make this decision appropriately if the staff has probably conceded to NOAA behind the scenes. So I request CRMC to council to deny this concurrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matera.
Next is Lori Terracani.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the council. My name is Lori White, and I am president of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce. And I am here on behalf of the chamber tonight to speak in support of the South Fork project. It is no secret that the economy faced a major setback because of the work that's been done over the last several months in response to the COVID virus and the opportunity that we have before us to rebuild our economy. I'd like to be clear that strong and robust economic growth will come from investment in renewable and green energies, as we've discussed tonight. And our states and the country must begin to invest in the energy infrastructure that will power us to a sustainable future. And here in Rhode Island, we have already made great strides in being a leader in offshore wind. Here in Rhode Island, of course, we do know that good paying jobs and incredible investment comes from offshore wind and empowering those who seek to change the future of American energy. Ørsted has shown great commitment to the people of Rhode Island, and by locating their innovation hub here in our state and ensuring deep ties to the state and those who put offshore wind turbines in the water. Climate change is an evolving threat that endangers coastal economies, and states and mitigation experts through renewable energies will be essential to the long-term health benefits of our local economy, in addition to the jobs that we've heard about tonight, in addition to the supply chain opportunities that exist for Rhode Island, and in addition to continuing to put Rhode Island on the map as a leader in offshore wind. In conclusion, on behalf of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to thank you for affording me this opportunity to speak with you this evening, and I encourage you to approve the South Fork Wind Farm. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. White.
Next, I have James Spalt.
Hello, good evening, Madam Chair and board members. Thanks for allowing me to speak. My name is James Spall. My brothers and I own and operate lobster and crab boats, as well as a day scallop boat out of Bedford. And in addition to that, we've all got extensive experience managing and operating vessels in the Gulf of Mexico in the oil and gas fields. So I thought it might be helpful for me to just share some of our experiences from the Gulf of Mexico as it relates to some of the discussions that are taking place here in regard to the wind farms.
Madam Chair, excuse me, and I'm sorry, Mr. Spald. But
Yeah.
did I hear that your boats operate out of New Bedford?
Yes.
Okay. And I want to just advise the council on that. The purpose of the regulatory oversight for CRMC is the shoreside effects in Rhode Island. So I'm not so sure that testimony from this fisherman operating out of a Massachusetts port who's going to discuss matters in the Gulf of Mexico are relevant to the exercise.
Okay, well, thank you for pointing that out. We'll consider that as to wait. Go ahead, Mr. Spalt.
Okay. I just would like to highlight that, in comparison to what you get from large oil and gas operators, the cooperation that you're seeing from Ørsted and other developers in regard to fishermen is exceptional. Certainly I've never seen anything like that come from the likes of an ExxonMobil or a Shell. As far as recreational fishing goes, I think it's certainly difficult to deny that there may be some impact to fishing during the construction process. However, I think, beyond that process, the wind farms would provide an overall net positive. The fishing in the Gulf of Mexico around the rigs is world-class and some of the best that I've experienced. And we think that, in general, there's a great opportunity to, cooperate with the wind farms and potentially derive an additional source of income. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Spalt.
Next is Nicole DiPaolo.
Hello, chair members and Madam Cervanka, Madam Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to speak tonight on behalf of the consistency certification for the South Fork Wind Farm. My name is Nicole DiPaolo, and I am testifying on behalf of the National Wildlife Federation, whom I work for on their offshore wind program. And I am a Rhode Islander born and raised, and I'm really proud to live in this state that was the first champion of offshore wind energy, and even more a champion for doing it right. And to us, doing it right means attention to responsible development and really thorough stakeholder engagement. We believe that the ocean stamp process is a really strong example of this stakeholder engagement, getting input from all stakeholders and using as many outlets as possible to reach the public and get them involved in this process. Now, nearly a decade later, offshore wind energy is poised to take off with the Biden administration's commitment to double down on climate solutions, to commit 40% of all benefits to disadvantaged communities, and to deploy 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The National Wildlife Federation has long advocated for the responsible development of this resource, and with a national goal of this scale, we are committed now more than ever to ensuring that it's done right. Our support for responsibly developed offshore wind hinges on two key components. First, it is science-based, so the best available science, technology, and data are used to assess, avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to wildlife and marine and terrestrial environments and ecosystems. And second, that it's people-centered, that the transition to renewable energy is informed by all stakeholders, centers disadvantaged communities that have been most impacted by our current energy systems, provides the support, adequate support for folks to participate in and receive the environmental, health, and economic benefits of the clean energy economy, including domestic content and use of unionized labor and workers' protection. So I'm really grateful for all the awesome labor testimony from union labor tonight. So we believe that it's possible to build this industry with stringent wildlife and habitat protections in place every step of the way, avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating impacts to the coastal and marine environments. Again, that is key to our support of the development of this resource. And with these components, we call on the state of Rhode Island to do everything in its power to ensure that projects are developed responsibly with these strong protections in place, especially for our most vulnerable species like the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. Ensuring that strategies to minimize potential impacts from offshore wind development activities keep pace with the changing ocean conditions requires careful and persistent attention, and we look to the state of Rhode Island, federal regulators, and project developers to ensure this industry advances responsibly. While responsible development of large infrastructure projects in federal waters is certainly a challenge, we believe it's one that we must take on. The potential benefits of responsibly developed offshore wind power are difficult to overstate. States across the nation are relying on offshore wind energy to meet their energy goals that are necessary for the prosperity of our economies in the face of a rapidly changing climate. A new report from the National Resources Defense Council estimates that financial costs to our health from fossil fuel generated air pollution and climate change surpass $820 billion in health costs each year in the US alone, and that this burden falls heaviest on vulnerable communities. Advancing equitable climate solutions is especially important for historically marginalized communities that are highly concentrated in formerly redline districts that can be on average 12.5 degrees warmer than non-redline districts. And higher temperatures results in increased air pollution, resulting in premature death, higher risk of heat stroke and other heat-related illnesses, as well as adverse developmental, reproductive, and carcinogenic effects. Additionally, offshore wind is the largest scale utility clean energy resource for Northeast states to transition from fossil fuel power plants, create tens of thousands of jobs with a just transition for fossil fuel workers, provide economic benefits to states and historically marginalized individuals, and prevent tons of carbon emissions from being released into the atmosphere. In conclusion, while our support for offshore wind development is entirely contingent on it being done right by wildlife and communities, it is also urgent in the face of climate change that we harness this untapped resource and the abundant benefits it has to offer. We urge the CRMC to recognize the value of offshore wind opportunity and support moving this critical climate solution forward in a manner that works for the Rhode Island's environment and communities. We look forward to working together to ensure this and all projects built off the coast of Rhode Island meet federal consistency requirements of the Coastal Zone Management Act through compliance with the state's ocean SAMP and are developed responsibly with strong protections in place for our most vulnerable wild coastal and marine wildlife. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. DiPaolo.
Next, I have Dennis
Lassage.
Sorry.
Thank you, and thank you, Madam Chairman. My name is Dennis Lassage, and I represent the North Atlantic States Regional Council of Carpenters. I speak for the 2,200 carpenters, pile drivers, and millwrights within Rhode Island, and today I'm speaking in full support of South Fork Wind. At the national level, our organization is strongly aligned with President Biden's executive order, which puts the current climate crisis front and center and directs all agencies of the federal government to do what can be done to combat it. It is folly to ignore the urgency of this directive and impede these efforts. At a regional level, we applaud the mandates from the various states of the Northeast for a just transition to renewable energy in an aggressive but wholly appropriate timeframe. This project is a viable and much needed means to achieve those mandates. We believe in a clean energy future and a just transition to that future that includes the creation of family-sustaining jobs for the workers who build and operate the new clean energy facilities and generators. We support an industry that recognizes the value and necessity of a professionally trained, highly productive workforce committed to the same goals as South Fork Wind, a just transition to a clean energy future. I reemphasize the support of the North Atlantic States Regional Council of Carpenters for South Fork Wind, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Lassage.
Next is Matt Linnell.
Good evening. My name is Matt Linnell. I'm a commercial fisherman. I've been commercial fishing for over 35 years, and I have fished in the past in this area with gill nets. mainly in the fall and early spring for skate and dogfish. Most of the fixed gear fishing in the area is lobster and crab gear. The way the South Fork windmills are being placed should have minimal effects. They may even enhance the area because they are being placed on softer bottom. This will add some more structure to the area. With oceans warming, we all need to do our part to reduce carbon emissions. If I didn't believe that wind and fishing couldn't exist, I wouldn't support it. I don't feel there'll be any navigation issues, being that they are a mile apart. That is plenty of room to navigate through them. If you've seen boats in the closed area fishing for scallops, we're on top of each other all the time and there's no accidents. I'm assuming there will be some sort of AIS or automatic identification systems with all the modern electronics we have. It shouldn't be a problem to navigate through. I also feel the charter business will benefit, more structure to fish off of. I think another benefit will be tours. I noticed Block Island has some tours and to see their windmills. I'm sure this will become an attraction for some. After looking at some of Ørsted's other projects around the world, they have gone above and beyond to appease the fishermen. Being a fixed gear fisherman, you will move somewhere else during the construction. No fisherman in the right mind is going to risk losing gear, especially when they know exactly where the construction is going to be. If the noise is a problem which has been stated, why would you want to haul empty fishing gear in that area? I don't really need the practice. In conclusion, I feel wind has great potential to meet the future energy needs in the future. I know people are resistant to change, but I know I am, but these leases have a change for the better, I feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Liddell.
Next is Tom Giordano.
Good evening. Thank you for the time. My name is Tom Giordano, and I'm the Executive Director of the Partnership for Rhode Island. Partnership for Rhode Island is a CEO roundtable of the largest employers in the state, from Brown University to CVS, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Hasbro, Amica, and Electric Boat. Our partnership was brought together with the common idea that Rhode Island should have a thriving economy and should lead on important issues. Offshore wind and climate change are two of those. South Fork Wind will bring jobs and infrastructure investment to this state. We're also excited about the innovative and economic growth, especially coming out of this pandemic, that could be transformative for our economy. While my board members and their companies continue to hire Rhode Islanders, large infrastructure projects and the investment that comes with them have the potential to outsize any organic growth by anchor institutions. And we see South Fork Wind as a tremendous opportunity to attract new innovative employers to our state. We're also impressed by the proposed investment in Provport and excited that Provport will be on the ground floor of a new American industry, and that's really exciting. Ørsted has done a great job by helping to build that ecosystem themselves by moving their U.S. headquarters here and starting an innovation hub. And we've seen supply chain companies follow them. The economic benefits that will come to Rhode Island and to our neighbors with the commitment to green energy will help our planet and help our economy, especially coming out of a time of need, which we're about. I'll stay short and say that I hope this board approves the South Fork Wind Farm because the economic benefits that will come from continued keeping a business climate that is attractive to innovative companies like Ørsted will bring enormous value.
The last couple words you said were breaking up. Can you repeat them?
I apologize. In summation, I was just closing up. The economic benefits for us here in Rhode Island and beyond that, with ours and our neighbors' commitment to green energy, will help heal our planet and our economy, which will sorely need it as we come out of the pandemic economy. In finishing up, I want to thank you for your time. I've been on this call, as many of you, all of you have, for now 7 or 8 hours since the last meeting. So thank you for your time. I'll keep mine short, but I hope and encourage you to approve the South Fork Wind Farm.
Thank you, Mr. Giordano.
Thank you.
Next is Kate Almeida.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. My name is Katie Almeida, and I work for the Town Dock, a family-owned company that's been in Point Judith for over 41 years. We own 6 fishing vessels that are otter trawl vessels that fish primarily for squid. The debate here tonight is not about whether or not these farms should be built. I think we all know that they're going to be built and they're going to be put in. It's about building responsibly. I'm hearing such a lack of concern for the effects of the ecosystem, and that's frightening for people who depend on a healthy ecosystem and a thriving ocean to make a living. And it's not just about making a living, and it's not just about making a quick buck. It's about a healthy and thriving ocean, which we're going to need in the face of climate change. My company may not fish for squid in this particular area, but we certainly depend on the squid that spawn in that area. Squid spawn once a year and live less than a year. What's going to happen to that particular species when a generation of squid is subjected to construction? The effects of vibration, construction, pile driving. There are studies out there that show negative effects on squid larvae and squid eggs. I also want to point out that we're looking at this as piecemeal, company by company, slice of ocean by slice of ocean. And that's not how we should be looking at that. We should be looking at this safety issues, transit issues, ecosystem issues, biological issues, economic issues as a whole continuous area. But we keep going down slice by slice, and that's not how an ecosystem works. I want to make a quick comment too about the beginning of this meeting. It's very unfortunate that Ørsted was trying to shut the industry out by not wanting to hear the industry opinions or their expert advice. We keep hearing about trust issues and transparency issues. I'm very involved in the wind energy process. And I know those are 2 very big issues within this industry. And at the beginning of this call, when there was, they prevented Tom Sproul from speaking about the economic impacts, which I really think he should have been allowed the time so we can actually hear what we want to support and understand what we want to support. We can't truly comment on something if we don't truly understand it, and he should have been given that time. In conclusion, I hear about how amazing this development is going to be for Rhode Island, but I want to remind people that Rhode Island is the squid capital of the world, the country, the East Coast. We bring in more squid on the East Coast than any other state. We even have calamari as the state appetizer. And I just want to remind people that we shouldn't be completely forgetting and pushing aside one industry for another. There's a whole successful industry down there in Point Judith, and I think people really need to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Almeida.
Next is Mike Feeler.
I thank you all for the opportunity to be able to speak tonight. I'm going to speak a little bit about my experience with Ørsted. Commercial fishermen operate in what we all know is a very hostile marine environment that has unique challenges that cause it to be labeled by many as most dangerous profession. Matter of fact, in the past couple of weeks, we've lost a couple boats, one being out of Point Judith. The chance for us to coexist and work with developers such as Ørsted and offshore wind energy industry provides an opportunity to upgrade our safety equipment, increase and accelerate our training, enhance our education. Furthermore, the additional work provides an alternative revenue source and a vehicle to offer continued employment for crew and captains during slow periods, closures, or low seafood prices like we saw last year. During the COVID crisis of 2020, one fishing vessel that would have most likely remained at the dock due to low prices was able to work for 150 days alongside an offshore survey vessel for Ørsted. Several skippers and crewmen took advantage of offers to take safety training, captain's classes. A number received their 100-ton master's credentials, and a bridge simulator was opened to interested captains in Rhode Island by Ørsted. Safety management systems, which are required by most developers, but this one in particular addresses the health and safety welfare of individuals working aboard these boats on these projects. Issues such as proper rest, staffing levels, drug, alcohol policies, COVID policies, firefighting, all these are requirements. Products which have only been recently introduced in the US through offshore wind includes something like the safety folder, which is an interactive online tool that assists in managing onboard safety drills, as well as any life-saving devices. There are currently very few requirements for safety equipment aboard commercial fishing vessels in the United States. However, Ørsted requires international standards that have been putting money where their mouth is. They've been incentivizing upgrades and vessel improvements, paying for such items as search and rescue transponders, which detects radar, enhances the visibility to assist in the search and rescue of a vessel in distress. MISW, which is marine small vessel, small workboat inspections, are becoming increasingly common and bring about a new awareness of any deficiencies that may be occurring. I think that the one thing that's overlooked here is that these types of safety measures and processes wouldn't be taking place if it weren't for the developers. Like I said, I'm in favor of continuing to work with Ørsted. The alternatives to fossil fuel becoming a necessity, and one way to address these is through renewable wind energy. I think that the fishermen have an opportunity for coexistence with this industry, which will benefit all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thaler.
Ian Parenti is next.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, we can hear you. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
My name is Ian Parenti. I'm a second generation commercial fisherman, fishing out of Secana Point, Little Compton, Rhode Island. I don't know where to start. There's no one who's as concerned about renewable energy as we are. That being said, this is not green energy. Anyone stating that this is green energy is simply being paid to say so, or simply not educated on the subject. I've been fishing in this area for my entire life. My family's been fishing in this area for the better part of a century. The devastation we've seen just from the sonar work has been something I cannot even comprehend. The fish have left when they're doing the work. They've not returned. The only debate is whether they've been killed by the sonar or they've just left and gone elsewhere. But regardless, spawning has stopped in this area. Everything has stopped. I'd like, moving forward, anyone else to speak, to please tell us how much time they've spent on Cox's Ledge, their experiences there, and some sort of relevance as to where their opinions derive from other than the paycheck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Parenti. Mr. Moore, are we at the end of the list?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. So if that's the case, we'll close the public comment. We are going to give Ms. Desautels an opportunity to summarize in a more fuller way her position or response to the staff addendum that was issued today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for the additional time here to put together a summation of what Dr. Sproul would have testified to. Without repeating what I've already said, I'd like to add to that statement the following. In yesterday's meeting between the parties, Ørsted finally disclosed a funding analysis showing how the $5.2 million grows over time. This set off alarms for FAB members because the analysis showed that it takes 30 years for the 5.2 million to grow into 12 million. So the 5.2 is only equal to 12 million at the very end, like a savings bond. Further, the 5.2 million growing over time assumes that no claims are paid out of that amount. In other words, Ørsted provided direct evidence that the 5.2 million is not enough to pay the claims over the life of the project. Dr. Sproul and I repeatedly emailed CRMC staff yesterday to explain these points, but it seems as though the points were maybe not understood. Dr. Sproul also analyzed what happens if you try to pay $12 million over 30 years using the $5.2 million upfront. Using Ørsted's own funding analysis, the result is that the fund goes bankrupt after 15 years and with only $6.4 million of payments. Based on Dr. Sproul's analysis, the fund would need to start with 8.1 million in order to pay out 12 million over 30 years. The FAB's objection to the recommendation is based on the economics and what I just said. That's it. It's based on the economics. 5.2 million does not make the fisheries user groups whole. We continue to respectfully request that the council vote tonight to object to federal consistency based on the economics. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Okay, I think before we get into our deliberations, I want to take a break, or I need to take a break, and let's come back at 8. Thank you. Buddy. Okay. Mr. Boyd, I have a couple questions for you coming out of a couple of the public comments and then Ms. Desautel's last comment. One of them is that the findings, if you will, of the staff report the assertion that the findings don't match the conclusion or the recommendation. And the way that I read your findings is that you determined that this proposed wind farm will have an adverse impact, and without avoidance mitigation, there would be inconsistency with the enforceable policies. So if you don't have any mitigation, you just have this adverse impact, then it doesn't meet enforceable policies. Once you determined there was adverse impact, you then had to look to see if there was appropriate avoidance, if possible, and mitigation, and what those components were. So your findings were, yes, adverse impact, but if you have appropriate mitigation, then it goes back into the conclusion of consistent with enforceable standards. Is that correct?
That's correct, Madam Chair. Actually, the goals of the ocean SAMP are first to avoid impacts. When there are unavoidable impacts, they are to be minimized to the greatest extent. And then those impacts that cannot be avoided and or minimized need to be mitigated. And in this case, yes, we found that there will be adverse impacts from this project. Ørsted, Eversource, the joint venture here, even clearly states in their mitigation proposal of September the 28th, recognizes the need for mitigation as a result of this project. That is why they put forth a mitigation proposal. And we spent many months going through the mitigation process to try and come to an acceptable mitigation proposal that included Ørsted's original offer of compensatory mitigation. So with the staff's proposed project minimization here for no more than 12 turbines out of the possible 15 that BOEM could approve, and the fact that the proposed mitigation that has been offered, which is $12 million over 30 years, which if paid in one lump sum is in today's dollar value, $5.2 million. With the combination of the compensatory mitigation offered by the developer, along with the staff recommended project minimization, including all the other mitigation measures that the developer has put forth, staff feels that this project would, as conditionally recommended, could meet concurrence. And that's why we're recommending a conditional concurrence, which would include the minimization alternative.
And this relates to what Ms. Desautels just talked about as far as the present value of that $12 million over 30 years reduced to 5.2. Are you comfortable that it's 5.2? Have you reviewed the information necessary for you to understand that that's the appropriate number?
Well, as the executive director has stated previously, CRMC staff are not economists. We rely on information that is provided to us. And in fact, the FABS expert in this matter is Dr. Sproul, who also indicated that the net present value of $12 million over 30 years in his calculations was $5.6 million. However, he was using a different value in determining a factor of the net present value than Ørsted was. Ørsted represented it was $5.2 million. And in an email received by us just last night, I believe, probably around 8 p.m., that it was conceded that indeed it was $5.2 million is the net present value of 12 million over 30 years. That's our understanding of it.
Okay, thank you. All right, do others have questions for Mr. Boyd on the staff report, or we can open it up for general discussion?
Yes, Madam Chair, I have a question for Mr. Boyd.
Please.
In the revised staff recommendation, it talks about the 5.2 million being payable to the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust. And then Attorney Main, in her response, she was concerned about that. After hearing that, do you have any anything that you'd like to change or adjust about that recommendation regarding the Viability Trust, or do you think that should stand the way that it is in the recommendation?
The staff recommendation stands. We feel that the fishermen need to control their destiny in this matter, and they need to control the funds in terms of how they feel best the industry needs to be served by any mitigation monies. So the staff recommendation stands.
Okay, thank you.
To follow up on that, I'm sorry, Mr. Gomez, but just to follow up on that issue, the one of the concerns raised was just the release aspect. Once there's funding, would there be, some confidence that there would be a release, as opposed to if you had a claims process where you would get that release as you go along. and this might be better directed towards Mr. DeSisto, but is that something that this council can delegate to you and the staff to determine how you would effectuate something like that?
Yes, I think that's something that's going to have to be a part of the motion, whatever the motion is, for the council, if the matter is to move forward with the recommendation from staff, that would be made part of the motion to make sure that there is some type of a claims process that would be part of the mitigation standalone agreement like we had with Vineyard Wind.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Mr. Gomez?
That was exactly what I was going to ask, how the trust would be set up and the issue of the claims process. So, and I think what we just said was that would be part of the attorney and staff process to, as long as it's part of the motion, that there'll be a claims process and a trust setup by the FAB, that they would put the brick and mortar to it, if you will, I guess, and construct that trust and the claims process. Is that correct? That the staff and the legal will be drafting the how we do it, how we do the trust and how we do the claims process.
Well, the agreements that I adverted to, that would be drafted by staff and legal counsel. Now, I should point out that the trust instrument for Vineyard Wind has not yet been drafted. That's something that would be under the that's something that CRMC would have a review process on, but there is a procedure in the Vineyard Wind agreement as to how it will be constructed, including the hiring of an independent attorney to actually draft the trust document. That hasn't been done yet, but the agreements were, and that would be staff and attorney.
Yeah, good. That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Was that the requirements on how to construct it? It was in, I think it's referred to as a side agreement in the Vineyard Wind. Is that where you found that? And then the actual document itself would spring forth, after closing and the necessity for a fund?
Correct. I prefer to refer to the agreements that were had with Vineyard Wind as standalone agreements.
Standalone.
Yeah, that are separate and apart, although commonly staff refers to it as a side agreement. But
Okay.
the plain fact of the matter is, on a legal basis, it's a standalone agreement. And that's what's being recommended here by staff for the conditional concurrence.
And that standalone agreement would be something that would be put into place before the expiration of the stay agreement on the 22nd of this month?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. But the actual trust document would come at a later time?
That's correct.
Okay.
Madam Chair, Ray Cole.
Separately.
Thank you. Mr. Koya.
I have a question of Anthony. If council was to support Attorney Main's request, as she referenced the 9/28, take that to be a September 28 term sheet with a direct compensation fund, third-party administrator, and releases and the like, what would CRMC's role, staff or yours be in effectuating that? Same thing, similar to what staff is talking about with Vineyard?
That's correct. It would be the same thing.
Okay,
We just have to draft the necessary agreements.
thank you.
Any other questions, discussion from other council members? Okay, Mr. Gagnon.
Nothing's exactly specific to this. It's been a difficult and uncomfortable process.
And I know we have to go, I believe we have to do this again for Revolution Wind, which is 704 megawatts. And I guess if there's an opportunity to look forward and try to figure out how to come up with a compensation number based on some information that we've just experienced, and maybe develop a model or a formula that would help address the uncertainty and try to get a more agreeable and fair number down the road, if that can be possible. I think that's something we should work on, because I don't know if we've done it with this one, but there's no really way to tell yet, as no turbines are out there yet, and we don't really know what the effects are.
Madam Chair, if I can address Mr. Gagnon's, I guess, request there, if you will. In the course of our mitigation discussions with Ørsted and the FAB over these many months, we did in fact suggest a methodology to come up with a mitigation settlement here for the parties. What we recommended was the use of the Vineyard Wind mitigation model that was set forth last year, with Vineyard Wind putting forth a mitigation proposal with the state of Massachusetts for their coastal zone management consistency certification. Recall that there was difficult negotiations in the Vineyard Wind process with Rhode Island and Rhode Island Fishermen. However, an agreement was reached after debating the value of the fisheries and things like the trust and the direct compensation issues, etc. At any rate, there is a mitigation methodology that Vineyard Wind has produced that has been accepted by the state of Massachusetts last year in May of 2020. And indeed, Vineyard Wind has recommended this exact methodology to the offshore wind industry, at least for the southern New England area. We would encourage Ørsted to adopt that methodology. However, its use in the South Fork wind matter, which we encourage Ørsted to use, they rejected it. And for all the reasons that they can lay forth, but they did reject the use of the Vineyard Wind methodology because they didn't agree with the assumptions that were being used in that methodology. However, rather than reinventing the wheel, we think it is an appropriate way forward for future projects. And we would encourage Ørsted to adopt the Vineyard Wind methodology put forth last year for this project coming forth, Revolution Wind, as well as for Sunrise Wind, Bay State Wind, and the other developers, Equinor and Mayflower, that have leases in the southern New England wind energy area.
So follow-up question, is that going forward something we can mandate, that a model that we think is fair and works be used, so that it kind of cuts down on how much uncertainty and debate there is?
I don't believe we can mandate it. We can certainly recommend it to the developer and encourage them to use the methodology. In particular, if the Fishermen's Advisory Board, in its advisory capacity to the CRMC, recommends its usage in what they might consider a fair and equitable mitigation agreement. But we cannot mandate that any developer use this particular mitigation methodology.
I'd agree with that on a legal basis. That's not something that the council staff is authorized to do. Notwithstanding that, I do think that for the next project, there will definitely be changes in how the matter is handled by CRMC when it comes to these mitigation issues.
Madam Chair, Ray Coya.
Mr. Koya.
Well, I think each one stands alone, and what we have before us is the Orsted project, and we don't need to speculate what's going to happen going forward or formulas to use. We have before us a $5.2 million offer, and I think that's what we need to deal with tonight. I understand what Ron's saying, but with uncertainty, speculation, and that, to come up with a plan, that an equation is not somewhere that we want to go.
Yeah, you both make fair points. I think Mr. Gagnon's point to continue to improve the process to fulfill the OSAMP objectives, that's a good goal. But I understand we take this particular project on its own merits and based on what's happened. So, Mr. Gomez, yeah.
Yeah, a couple of points I'd like to make. I have a real strong, very strong background in underwater acoustic noise, etc. And I would note that the acoustic noise, which has been discussed previously by some of our presenters, the acoustic noise and the percussive effects associated with the construction is going to have the biggest effect, I think, in the long run. And the idea of front end loading, because I expect that's where the biggest amount of damage is going to occur to the fishermen. So the idea of front end loading it, i.e. the 5.2 million up front as a present value of the 30-year estimate is probably the best way. And on the other end of this, looking at devices that have platforms that have been built and are out at sea, the 25 years where we get to tear down on these, to me is highly unlikely. I think that their lives will be extended. I think there'll be life extension programs, and I think we'll likely exceed the demolition of these units unless it's mandated that they have to come down. I'm willing to bet that if kept in decent condition, although the state doesn't have a great record in bridges, but if they kept reasonable maintenance on them, they're likely to exceed that, which is just another case for allowing much of the funding to come up front. So just an observation, I think the front end loading is the right way to go.
As I've stated earlier, I agree with you, Mr. Gomez, as far as the front end loading, because I think you'll have uneven impacts, and funding it at the outset has the best chance of addressing the more serious impacts when the impacts are occurring. So I agree with you.
Thank you. I agree, yes.
Mr. Boyd.
Madam Chair, just a couple of points. I agree with Mr. Gomez, and that's precisely why staff, rather than the proposed compensatory offer of 12 million over 30 years, staff is recommending that the net present value of $5.2 million is paid in one single lump sum within 60 days of financial close. And that entire amount, it's our recommendation, goes into the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust once established. And it will be established prior to the South Fork project being approved by BOEM, which is highly likely, and them reaching financial close, which will most likely be in 2022. We fully expect, given Vineyard Wind's recent federal approval, that they will reach financial close this summer, and therefore the Fishermen's Viability Trust will be established this summer. We are not recommending two separate funds like with Vineyard Wind, a direct compensation fund and the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust. We are recommending for South Fork that all the money be put into the trust, and then the Fishermen's Trust deal with any claims made by fishermen who are in the South Fork area that are adversely impacted, not to be dealt with through a separate direct compensation fund. Rather, the fishermen will be responsible for dealing with any and all claims of adverse impact. So that's our recommendation. The other thing is there were a couple of comments tonight, and I think it's important that we as staff address these. One was from Fred Matera, who I have an incredible amount of respect for. I've worked with Fred over several years here, starting with Vineyard Wind. And Fred indicated that it was his position that David Kaiser of NOAA had undue influence on the CRMC recommendation here. I want to stress in no uncertain terms that David Kaiser had no influence on the CRMC staff recommendation here. CRMC staff did consult with David Kaiser because he is a federal consistency expert in NOAA and has worked for NOAA for over 30 years. When we developed our recommendation for a conditional concurrence, we consulted with David Kaiser as to how we could put forth that conditional concurrence to make sure that it would indeed meet the federal requirements. But David Kaiser did not tell us that we had to do X or we had to do Y in terms of putting forth our recommendation. So I just wanted to clarify that NOAA did not dictate what the CRMC staff recommendation would be, plain and simple. The other comment made by Katie Almeida of Town Dock, and again, I have a great deal of respect for Katie, and I think she brought up an excellent point here, that we should not be evaluating these projects on a case-by-case basis, but rather look at them all holistically. Wonderful idea. It's something we've been advocating for at the federal government level. The problem is we are subject to the regulatory process of the federal government. So when a project is ripe, in other words, a developer puts forth a construction and operation plan, BOEM then approves that construction and operation plan to move forward through the environmental impact statement process. NOAA issues a notice of intent to begin the draft environmental impact statement. That is when the states are filed the consistency certification by the developer and our CZMA federal consistency review begins. That is mandated by the federal regulations. The state has no say in that matter as to the timing or the scope of the project other than what BOEM puts forth in the notice of intent. So I just wanted to clarify those 2 points on the record and happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Boyd. Any questions from council members on what Mr. Boyd just said or comments? I support the 5.2 million being payable to the Rhode Island Fishermen's Viability Trust because I worry about a third-party entity making determinations for the fishermen that's akin to an insurance process, which you have to have certain pieces and paper support and check off the boxes. And if you don't meet those, you can be denied. So I do worry about a third-party claims process a lot. I would rather it be the fishermen that are in control of those claims. I also understand the developer's concern about releases. And as Mr. DeSisto spoke to earlier, that can be delegated to him and the staff and to figure that out between tonight and the 22nd. through the standalone agreement. Correct, Mr. DeSisto?
That's correct, yes.
I just note that Miss Main is raising her hand. I know we're in deliberations. Mr. DeSisto, how do you advise?
At this point, I think you're in deliberations. You have to go forward. We
Okay.
understand what the arguments are. I do. And I do think that the concerns, if, by the way, the vote is not to object, if the vote is for the conditional concurrence, that the concerns of the developer can be addressed during the agreement process.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Boyd.
Madam Chair, just one other clarification that Attorney Main made earlier on. She had indicated that Ørsted had been in contact with BOEM, again here, the lead federal permitting agency for offshore wind projects, with regard to the CRMC staff proposed conditional concurrence. And our recommendation to the council tonight as part of the number 2, the conditional concurrence, is that the council required the developer to file a letter with BOEM modifying its project and agreeing to the state's condition requiring the project minimization alternative pursuant to the federal consistency rules and regulations. Attorney Main pointed to that exact federal regulation at 15 CFR 930.4 subsection A-2. That is under the conditional concurrence section of the federal consistency regulations. And basically what it says is that if a state issues a conditional concurrence, and I can read that actual subsection, the federal agency for subpart C, applicant for parts D and I, person for subpart E, and that, by the way, is where offshore wind comes in under subpart E, or applicant agency for subpart F shall modify the applicable plan, project proposal, or application to the federal agency pursuant to the state agency's condition. So what we're merely asking for here is that Ørsted submit a letter to BOEM indicating that they agree with the state's condition. And again, this is for the project minimization, a maximum of 12 turbine foundations, not 15 that BOEM could approve. And therefore, this letter to BOEM from the developer acknowledging that it agrees with the state's condition. We're not asking the developer to submit a modification of their construction and operation plan, merely a letter acknowledging that they agree with the state's condition in this matter. That's all we're asking for, and we're not asking for a change to the construction and operation plan.
Thank you for that clarification. Ms. Main, I see you're raising your hand again, but we've already been advised by Mr. DeSisto that we're not to take your comment in the middle of deliberations.
You know, you went right into deliberations after public comment without giving an opportunity. You haven't made a motion yet. I asked for the accommodation to make 2 brief statements. They're important.
Yeah, and I object to that. There's a procedure here that Attorney DeSisto has already weighed in on, and we're in the middle of deliberating. It's not appropriate.
See, that's the problem you run into. You get the back and forth on this thing. I think you just got to go forward on it. And you know what? I'm going to make an educated guess here that the council is aware of all of the issues. I know there's been statements made. I don't think either party is entirely happy with what the staff has had to say on this thing, but I do think it's time to just get going on the motion on this thing.
Madam Chair, if the timing is right, Ray Coy would like to make a motion.
Yes, Mr. Koya,
Am I recognized for a motion?
you are recognized.
All right, Madam Chair, based upon the record before this council, which includes the application materials, testimony, both lay and expert, as well as the demonstrative evidence put forth, and taken into consideration the opinions of CRMC staff who participated in over 30 meetings in an effort to effectuate a balanced review process, weighing coexisting uses and utilizing the best information CRMC has been provided with. I move to accept and approve the finding of concurrence of consistency with the minimization from 15 to 12 turbines, the compensatory mitigation of $5.2 million as offered by the developer to be paid and set up according to their September 28th term sheet as referenced, with a direct compensation fund where claims are handled by a third-party administrator, paid out of an escrow account, and duly executed releases afforded to them when claims are paid, with staff and our council being part of that process, and not requiring that the developer notify BOEM of changes to the project as requested. That's my motion.
Madam Chair, Jerry Sajan, I second the motion.
Okay.
For clarification purposes, it's a conditional concurrence of consistency based on the conditions that you have in your motion, correct?
Well, that the minimization from 15 to 12 turbines, which they've agreed upon, and the $5.2 million payable in one lump sum as offered by the developer in the fund as previously enumerated.
And further clarification, these conditions that you have, particularly for the monetary compensation, would be reduced to an agreement that would be separate and apart from the decision of the council.
Yes, as
Thank you.
previously discussed, yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, discussion on the pending motion.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Sahajian.
Jerry Sahajian. As a council, I think we have to be mindful of our limited scope and jurisdiction on this matter. And we are here to determine if it meets federal consistency. And based on the evidence, the record, and all the comments from staff, the applicants and the objectors, it's clear that it does. So I will be voting in favor of this motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments, discussion?
One question.
Yes, Mr. Gagnon.
So if we remove the requirement to have the developer file a letter with BOEM, does this consistency, this conditional concurrence become part of BOEM's record anyway? Or how does BOEM view the conditional concurrence?
Mr. Boyd or Mr. DeSisto, can you address that?
Well, the concurrence is based on these conditions. If there is an objection by the developer, the concurrence is turned into an objection and they would take an appeal on that basis. So if they don't take an objection, if they don't object, the conditions would be part of the approval and the consistency, and that would be incorporated by reference with BOEM. And I do know that there was correspondence between the developer and BOEM on this issue, where the developer acknowledged that they would be reducing the amount of the turbines from 15 to 12.
Ray Hoyer,
Yes.
is Ray Hoyer recognized? So that's not part of my motion, that it's incorporated. that the conditional concurrence with everything that's set forth in the addendum today. Because that,
Yeah.
that calls for a letter. So I'm calling out that, and I'm not requiring them to put money to the Fisherman's Viability Trust.
Correct. In lieu of the requirement of the letter, one of your conditions is that, unless I'm wrong, that the project would be 12 turbines instead of 15.
Correct.
So basically what I'm saying is the fact that that is a part of your motion in the decision renders the fact of the letter moot. I think that's the purpose of your motion.
Correct.
I would ask on that point, Mr. Boyd, is that the letter to BOEM, is that somewhat duplicative of the condition that the turbines would be reduced from 15 to 12?
Well, as Attorney DeSisto pointed out, with the state, if we were to issue a conditional concurrence that requires no more than 12 turbine positions to be approved as part of this project, the applicant can choose to object to that. And in fact, if they do not agree with that condition, they would have to treat the conditional concurrence as an objection and appeal it to the Department of Commerce. Our recommendation was strictly for acknowledgement in writing to BOEM by the developer to acknowledge the state's condition in that they agreed with that condition, so that we would have that in the file and be able to attach that with any decision moving forward. I'll defer to legal counsel.
Okay, so my view on the pending motion, I don't agree with the funding mechanism as has been proposed by the developer. I agree with the funding mechanism that has been recommended by our staff. I think that is integral to his conclusion that this project will meet enforceable policies by placing control of these funds into the Fisherman's trust controlled by the fishermen. We've been assured that the releases could be figured out in the standalone agreement. So I don't think that going against our staff recommendation on that element of this decision will actually meet the enforceable policy. So I can't support the pending motion unless that's amended. Although I was prepared, I want you to know, to support a motion that would be in accordance with what is recommended by our staff, our conditional concurrence recommended by staff. Mr. Gagnon.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can live without the requirement for the letter, but I would support the staff recommendation for the funding also.
Madam Chair.
Mr. Sahajian.
So my concern is, as a council, once we vote on it, we lose control. And I think it's important that, you know, everyone here, okay, listen to all the testimony, and we should be the ones making the decision on what happens in the future. And I mean, I'll give you an example. Just, you know, last week, the majority of the board voted to, you know, end, I shouldn't say end, but to stop taking evidence and to let the applicants rest their case. And the majority of the council voted. And then, you know, I find out later on that that didn't happen. So my concern is we should vote, and we should have a say on the outcome of this matter. So that's why I will be supporting Mr. Coyer's motion. as submitted. Thank you.
Any other comments, discussion on the pending motion? Okay, if none, then I will do a roll call. Starting with Mr. Koya.
Koya votes aye on the motion.
Okay. Don Gomez,
Gomez votes aye.
Jerry Sahajian,
Sahajian, aye.
Patricia Reynolds,
Reynolds, aye.
Ron Gagnon,
Ben Gagnon, nay.
Lindsay McGovern,
Lindsay McGovern, aye.
and myself, Jennifer Cervenka, nay. The motion to approve as set forth by Mr. Koya's motion passes. And the additional work will need to be done in the time between tonight and June 22nd. Is there anything more from staff, Mr. DeSisto, that needs to be said?
No.
Okay, then I will make a motion to adjourn.
Koya seconds it.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Be safe.